I want to welcome everyone to this morning's workshop. A few notes on our agenda today. We have a large number of topics in the subject of wildfire mitigation ready to go, and I personally would like to hear what San Diego Gas and Electric has to say on all of these topics. So I would ask everyone to please be mindful of our agenda schedule. The company has built in some time at the end, half an hour from 11:30 to 12 as a final wrap up and question session. And I anticipate there may be some of these topics that some parties feel have not been covered in enough depth, and I would request that we develop a plan to address those in our final wrap-up session, and that we try to be mindful of the schedule set out in the agenda so that we can hear what the San Diego Gas and Electric has to say about all of these topics this morning. So with that, I would like to invite our assigned commissioner, Darcy Houck, to make a few remarks to start us off.
Thank you, Fred, and I just want to thank staff for all of their work in coordinating these workshops, and San Diego Gas and Electric for the presentation earlier this week and all of the parties' participation in that discussion. I know that, as you said, we've got a big agenda for today. I'm looking forward to listening and learning more as we go through the process. So I will turn it back to you, Fred, so we can get started on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. And really, I'm just ready to turn it over to Joe McCauley of Sempra to introduce the day's speakers.
Thanks, Fred. And thank you, Commissioner, as well for the opening remarks. As Fred mentioned, the agenda today, and so Brevin, you can show the agenda page, please. The agenda today reflects overviewing aspects of our wildfire risks that we have not yet discussed in workshops, with a focus on two topics, that being, that being the role of, or how public safety power shutoffs, PSPSs, are included in the wildfire safety risk analysis, and SDG&E's vegetation management programs. Fred, I'm not sure if you've already done it. I provided Fred a PDF of the presentation, and so Fred will forward that out to the invitee list as soon as he gets a chance.
It was sent out at approximately 8:30 this morning.
Okay, thanks. Before we get started, we would like to thank the parties who submitted suggested topics for today's workshop. We reviewed these in coordination with SPD to develop the agenda, and believe that we will be addressing the majority of the asks. Regarding some of the requested topics that are not included in the agenda, some of the questions, while pertaining to PSPS, were considered to be out of scope relative to RAMP. Some of the questions, some of the requested information is and will be provided on a regular basis as part of reports that are submitted within the wildfire mitigation plan. And then also, as Fred mentioned, we wanted to focus today's workshop on topics that we have not yet expanded upon in a workshop. And so to the extent a requested topic included continuing a discussion from a previous workshop, we will field those questions as best we can, as time allows, at the completion of today's agenda. If we run out of time, we ask parties to use the discovery process. Regarding today's agenda, as you can see on the screen, role of public power safety shutoffs and wildfire risk analysis, methodology for calculating wildfire risk analysis, methodology for assessing PSPS impacts on customers. We'll take a break around 10:45, 11 o'clock. You'll see in the light shade, role of climate change and wildfire risk analysis. That's on the agenda in a light shade. It was included in the draft agenda. And in talking with the team, we've decided, rather than having that as its own topic, we're blending that in within the other topics. And so I didn't want to just remove it from the agenda, because the group who asked for it may then say, well, what about that? You said you're going to be talking about it. So I left it there in a light gray shade to let you know that we will still be talking about it, but not as its own standalone topic. And then we'll be talking about vegetation management practices. And then again, in the initial draft, it had some additional language. Again, I wanted to leave it there, but just cross it out. We'll be talking about the management practices in totality, and then grid hardening mitigation impacts on vegetation management practices. We'll then have a wrap up. And then, as I said, to the extent there is additional time and we can field questions that folks have on previous workshops, some of the supplemental work papers, we will certainly do that. We'll have a general Q&A after each topic, and folks are certainly welcome within the presentations themselves to ask questions if they so desire. And before we get started, as I mentioned during Wednesday's workshop, would just like to give a reminder that the ramp proceeding is not a request for funds. As mentioned on SPD's website, it is part of the two-step process with the SMAP proceeding and the risk-based decision framework. Within those two proceedings, it identified minimum requirements for the ramp. We believe our ramp has been compliant with those aspects. And then also, as some of you may know, the commission has opened a new rulemaking, which they are reviewing. One of the scope issues is review lessons learned and how those lessons learned can help inform changes to what is required in the ramp. So that is my opening remark. If anyone has any questions before we get started? Tom, you're on mute.
Excuse me, sorry. Hi, this is Tom Long from Turn. Did Fred, did you say that you had sent around the slides for today? Because I don't believe I've received that email.
Yeah, I made a distribution to the service list this morning. I'll double check my send outbox here, make sure that.
I just got it at 9:05.
I sent it at 8:45.
Maybe it's slow at getting delivered for some reason.
Yeah, Tom, I just received it 2 minutes ago.
Okay, well, hopefully it will come soon. It does help to be able to, so that I can look ahead to what slides are coming up, so that it just helps me get better prepared.
Well, it should be arriving any moment. I would certainly expect.
Okay, thank you.
If no other questions, we can go to the next slide. And Mason, I think you are up.
Okay, let me turn my camera and microphone on. Can you all hear me? Okay, I guess I didn't know who's running the slides. Is that us, Joe, or is that staff, CPUC
No,
staff?
it's SP.
Okay.
SPD staff,
Right.
and I think Brevin, it was Wednesday. He may be the same one today.
Okay, perfect. Before I get started, I just want to give a special shout out to Christine Wong on my team. She was a very instrumental part of everything that you're going to see. She's very professional and intelligent, but she also helps me keep my mind together. And without her, none of this could be possible. So I just wanted to throw out some appreciation to Christine. So with that being said, the first topic here is the role of PSPS in wildfire risk analysis. It's an interesting topic, and the slides are going to talk about many aspects of that. So hopefully we'll get to what people wanted to hear. And if not, at the end of that section, we can stop and take some questions and hopefully field them. Assisting me today, or I'm assisting her, is Sarah Almajahed, and she's on the call as well. And if we have any questions that we think she will be better to answer, or some slides to handle, she will be handling those as well. So with all that being said, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the overview of how we're thinking about wildfire and PSPS risk is that we're starting with the enterprise risk register, and there is a single risk in our register called SDG&E wildfire involving SDG&E equipment. So in the RAM chapter, all of the PSPS impacts are contained in that chapter. So we've combined those into that. we think that keeping them together allows you to do the things that we're trying to do, and it doesn't prevent you from doing anything that you wanted to do. So for example, you can, some benefits, some mitigations have benefits for both PSPS and wildfire, and putting them together, we think allows people to understand the benefits better. You could separate them out, but in the end, you'd have to bring them back together for analytical purposes. So we've chosen to keep them together. And one of the goals for wildfire is to reduce the total wildfire risk score, which is the sum of the wildfire and the PSPS components. So throughout the ramp and the WMP and internally, the way we look at wildfire risk is the combination of the wildfire component and the PSPS component. And everything that we do starting a year or so ago is looking at both of those elements where applicable, and combining the risk scores and looking at the benefits in that way. And like I said, it doesn't prevent us from doing anything else that we want to do. And so that's how we're going to proceed with this section. And there's a pretty little picture of our ramp chapter where it's all contained, both the wildfire and the PSPS impacts. Next slide, please. So here's a visualization of how we look at that. And we thought we'd show it in the multi-attribute value kind of setting, the framework. Wildfire risk, I think, as you all know, has many different impacts. We kind of talk about the right side of the bow tie, which means what kind of consequences might come from wildfire. And it basically hits all of these that are shown: fatalities, serious injuries, acres burned. You can read that. But there's reliability piece, financial piece, and stakeholder impact piece. PSPS also hits most of those. The only one that it doesn't really hit is the acres burned. But, for example, for fatality, the consequence of a wildfire is that the wildfire could get going and then, you could hurt some people. The PSPS impact could also hurt people by not having the power, and things could arise from that. So the way that the safety incident could occur is different, but they both can lead to a safety incident. So those types of consequences go through our multi-attribute value function. You can see that first row or the first column of blue boxes: health and safety, reliability, financial, stakeholder impact. Each of those has separate analysis going towards it. And then in the end, we generate a total wildfire risk score. So let's go to the next slide. It's a very similar look, but it's a slightly different orientation, and that it shows that we have the ability to have them separated out, where we have on the left side of this slide, you have the PSPS impacts, and the WMP calls for us to break down risks and effectiveness of mitigations by the two tiers, tier 2 and tier 3. And so we've done that. We tried to make the ramp as similar to the WMP as possible. So wherever the WMP has an additional, I'll say, requirement, we tried to follow that in the ramp as well. So on the left, you can see we look at PSPS impacts separately at the beginning for tier 2 and tier 3, and then we look at wildfire impacts separately for HFTD, tier 2, tier 3. There's a few non-HFTD wildfire impacts thrown in there, and then in the end, those are combined to be the total wildfire risk score. And we're not going to go into too much of the math here, but I just wanted to show like an instance of what we're talking about, and that is the likelihood of a risk event, or as we call the LOR. On the wildfire side, we've determined, and remember that for us, a wildfire event is a reportable wildfire. So using that as an assumption or as a definition, tier 3, there's an expectation that the LOR is 5.13, and you can see for tier 2 6.84, and you can see the source of data. And then for the PSPS impacts, and we'll get to what the definition of a PSPS event is in a slide or two, but it's essentially 4 for both tier 3 and tier 2. So what we're trying to indicate here is that we do look at them separately. They're not blended from the beginning. The blending occurs after the math is done, but that's what allows you to work with a risk score for RSC purposes further down the road. So in the end, the LOR for all of it for wildfire is that 21.17, which is essentially how many reportable ignitions do we think we're going to see in the following year? And the 4 is how many PSPS impacts do we think we're going to have, PSPS events in the next year, which is 4. Little water break there for me. Okay, Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about the lore a little bit. I will start on the right side in this PSPS event definition. So I kind of say it two different ways, but essentially what we're saying is an event is when we start a PSPS activation and there is a contiguous, there's at least one customer, it doesn't have to be the same customer, it could be new customers, out contiguously or continuously until all customers are restored. So I think everybody knows that the way we do PSPS events is very targeted, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but we might do one segment, let's say at noon, and maybe those customers will be out till midnight, for example. And then during that time, new customers, maybe they went out at 6 p.m. or are going to be out till say 6 a.m. the next day. So in that limited example, we would say an event lasted from noon till 6 a.m. the next day. So whenever there's continuous, that's how we define an event. And using that definition, over the last few years, we've had 4 a year, and those events have affected customers who live in the tier 2 and in the tier 3 areas. When we do have events, it's averaged 12,000 customers per event. And the way we do lores and cores is we're looking at expected value or averages. So although the 12,000 is not a lore value, it's how many customers are out per event. I will say that's a little lumpy because we've had events where we've only shut off like 1,000 or so, and we've had other events that we've shut off. I think our highest was in excess of 70,000 customers. And the average estimated time that customers are out is around 32 hours. Again, that's a wide variation there. Some customers are only out for a few hours and some have been out for a couple of days. We've had events that have lasted multiple days, and unfortunately we've had to have customers off throughout the time. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So what we wanted to talk about in this section is we have mitigations in place that have risk reductions to the PSPS side of the equation, right? So we have many more mitigations in place that also help the wildfire. And so this is the list of ones that we say have PSPS risk reductions or reduction of PSPS impact. So I just briefly want to kind of go through what these are so people understand what they are. Actually, the very top one and the very two bottom ones are kind of like our system hardening. And I don't want your eyes to jump all around, but I'll just talk about it that way. The top one is cover conductor in tier 3, and the bottom two are strategic undergrounding for tier 2 and tier 3. So what we're saying is if we were able to harden either through cover conductor or through undergrounding, the amount of PSPS on that segment, and we'll get into what a segment means in a little bit, could be reduced as well. And so we can talk about what that reduction is, but essentially with cover conductor, if we cover conductor an entire segment, we feel that the need to do PSPS will be reduced. Most likely that the wind speeds that we feel comfortable running the system can be elevated because the system can endure more things. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But so the first one and the bottom two are system hardening. PSPS sectionalizing for both tier 2 and tier 3. Sorry, all that crazy code on the left, that's a unique identifier that you'll find in the ramp, and that's what we use in the ramp narrative, and then also like in the work papers and in the cost things. So it basically stands for SDG&E. It's our first risk. It's a control number, and there's some mitigation involved. And then the T1, T2 is the tier. So it's very technical looking, but it's pretty simplistic. PSPS sectionalizing essentially is when we go in and we add segmentation or sectionalizing to an existing segment. So for example, imagine that there's a segment that has 1,000 customers on it, and our meteorology team says, you know what, actually, it's the end of the line that's a lot more windy and risky than the front of the line. So if we were to put a switch somewhere in here, we probably wouldn't have to de-energize all 1,000 customers as much. So we would put in a switch and do it in an intelligent way and assign a weather station to it. So we would have control over now both sides of what used to be one segment. And that way we can reduce the impact of the PSPS activities to a smaller customer set. That's what PSPS sectionalizing. Microgrids are when we attempt to put a microgrid out in an area that would otherwise experience a PSPS. And so if the microgrid was in place, the microgrid would exist and it would have its own sort of isolation point, and maybe the whole circuit to that point would be de-energized. But if you open up the isolation point and fire up that microgrid, the customers that are downstream of the isolation point would still get their power. Sometimes there might be a little bit of a break where we de-energize the main circuit, but we try to do it seamlessly. So we're looking for these opportunities. So where can we put localized generation, as it were, and keep that system running while other parts of the circuit, it's too risky to run. And you can think of it, it's almost always in the context of the microgrid would be downstream of the substation. Like maybe the whole substation needs to go out, but because there's an area downstream that's either undergrounded or covered conductored, or it's just less risky there for maybe meteorological reasons or vegetation reasons, we think we could keep it on. But the only way to get power to it is having a local source of power. So that's the microgrid mitigation. The following 5, they go from resiliency grant programs, the standby power, and the resiliency assistant programs. These are all just fancy ways of saying generator programs. So in different flavors, they are generator programs that occur at the customer's premise. And there's some different technology, there's some different targeting, there's a little bit of other maybe regulatory focus on why they're broken out in this way. But they're essentially putting a generator at a home or a business and disconnecting the primary source of power from the utility and allowing the generator to provide partial or full backup power to the premise. And that's what those are. And so what we're saying is, if a customer has a generator during a PSPS event, they don't feel the PSPS impact because they still have power, whether it be full power or partial power. So that's a list of the PSPS, the mitigations that have some PSPS. I think I actually will, I've been talking a lot. I'll take a drink of water, and then if anybody has any questions about these 10 or 11, I'll be happy to field them now.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Hey, Eric from Turn. So you mentioned several times, this is something that I haven't quite understood, that you add together wildfire risk and PSPS risk to create one combined risk. And I guess to do that, would like the two measures of risk have to be completely independent, right? But when I think about wildfire risk, like the risk of doing a PSPS would go up when wildfire risk is higher. So are those two things really independent, and like how can you just add them together?
Yeah, the scoring is independent, but the logic of how we get to the numbers is not. So let me see if I can walk through that. So for example, right now in our current way of running our business, we have what we think is I'll say it's a PSPS policy. Now, it's not necessarily in writing, and we don't adhere to specific guidelines because there is a lot of dynamic things going on in our emergency operating center. But we have a theory of how we do stuff. And with that theory or policy in place, we feel that there will be a certain amount of PSPSing going on. And therefore, there's a certain amount of residual wildfire risk with that policy in place. However, I think what you're kind of driving at is if we made a decision to say, like, we're going to do a whole bunch more PSPS, we're going to, instead of shutting the power off at X, we're going to shut it off at 10 miles sooner, 10 miles an hour sooner. What that would have as the impact is raising the PSPS impact and then lowering the wildfire risk. But we're not really showing in the wrap, we're not really showing that because we're saying this is our PSPS, like how we're doing things. And so this is the level that we've come to. So we do that kind of logic first, figure out where we are in life, and then we add those two together afterwards.
Well, let me try it another. You're going big level. Let's go like really granular, like because you do this even like at a segment level, right?
Yeah.
So at a particular segment, what you do is you have wildfire risk and then PSPS risk, and then you add them together, right?
Yes.
What I'm saying is on that segment, as wildfire risk goes up, PSPS risk also goes up. And so adding them together is kind of is probably overstating that total risk versus keeping them completely separate. Because I understand the point that some of these mitigations only, let's say they only really reduce PSPS risk and not wildfire risk. So I understand that part of it, but the part of it where you add those things together, particularly at the segment level, you've got to be double counting something, because those two things are like just related, aren't they?
So I'm quite clear there's no double counting. I guess your premise of when the wildfire risk goes up, can you tell me what you mean by that?
So you conduct PSPS on the segment level when wildfire risk, which is driven by, let's say on the consequence side, is driven by wind speeds and humidity and stuff like that. So as that goes up, like on a particular segment, even when you're modeling it, that makes that segment also riskier for PSPS in terms of, so it both has a higher wildfire risk, but it's also more likely to, when you measure the risk of being PSPS, put it that way, that will also be higher.
Yeah. So the ramp analysis is not done at that real time kind of wind speed level. It's at the annualized with the segment the way it is right now over the next year. How much wildfire risk do we think is on that segment given its historical wind and other conditions? And how many times do we think, all this is estimations and forecasts, do we think that the PSPS will occur on that segment? So we say on that segment over the year, there's this much wildfire risk calculated separately, there's this much PSPS impact calculated separately, and then we add the two together. And so when we do a improvement, like if we go in and we do cover conductor, both the wildfire risk and the PSPS goes down. So that's how we're looking at it. So there isn't any double counting of anything going on. I see that look on your face, and maybe we're still talking.
Yeah, I mean, we can. I feel like you agreed with me that that as if a particular segment has a lot of wildfire risk, right? Both likelihood, consequence, that segment also has more PSPS risk. So I get the point that you're saying at the end that certain mitigations have different impacts on those two risks. I just worry about adding them together because to me, I don't know how you separate out wildfire risk from PSPS risk.
Yeah, so I think the way we handle that is we say, well, I'll just throw this out here and see if it sticks with the way you're thinking about it. If there was a segment, let's say two segments were exactly the same, and like every aspect about them was the same, except one had a little bit more wind than the other one. The way we're looking at it is that the second one wouldn't necessarily have more wildfire risk. It would have more PSPS impact because we've said that when wind gets above a certain level, we will be de-energizing at that level. So if one segment had a little bit more wind than the other, like let's say there was 4 events a year and one of those events was bigger on the other segment, we wouldn't necessarily say it has more wildfire risk and PSPS risk. We would just say it's going to have more opportunities for PSPS because that's when we're shutting it off. So we tried to look at it that way, and we're not necessarily, yeah. I think I know where you're going, and maybe I'm not explaining it very well, but there's definitely no double counting in. Well, hang on, I just got a note. Did we lose connectivity from some people?
I can hear you, but
yeah, it might be just me and you right now.
I can hear you. This is Commissioner Houck. I can still hear you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
That's good.
It looks like Joe might be having problems.
He's got a yellow triangle. Yeah, so we can go with on Joe and wish him the best.
Well,
yeah, I mean,
okay. I understand, and yeah, we can. maybe we did some DRs, and maybe if I see some of the math, I'll understand this better. I did have a question also about the last slide you're on. Yeah, this slide 8. I noticed that, and tell me if you're going to get to this later, but I noticed that for the wings model, there you have covered conductor and undergrounding, and that's like really granular. And for other programs, although not necessarily listed here, but like firm and prime and some of those, like those are just tier 3, tier 2. And I was wondering if those programs have more granular, at least prioritization models that you guys are using, like more like the wings to deploy them, or if they don't have those.
Yeah, so I'll ask Sarah to come in here to follow up with what I'm about to say, but for the most part, we're transitioning from prime and firm over to using wings for hardening. So there is some residual 2021, I believe, or 22. I might have my year wrong, where we're still using sort of, the older techniques, but going forward, almost all system hardening things like prime and firm will be using the segment level analysis. Going forward. However, I don't want to sugarcoat it all and say everything's going to be using wings, because right now the generator programs are not using wings because they're targeted at specific individuals. It's not really a segment question that wings is trying to answer. So there is a little bit of dynamicism going on between the application of the mitigation. In the end, in a few years out, after we feel more comfortable with wings and being able to apply it to more targeted assets, we will be working the asset risk reductions into the mix for how wings looks at the risk at the segment level. We're not there for this cycle yet. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have others, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Hi, Mason.
no problem.
Hi, Mason. This is Chris Parks, Cal Advocates. Thank you. I have a couple questions on this slide and one of the previous slides. So with PSPS, does SDG&E have any, you mentioned tier 2 and tier 3. I believe in Northern California, PSPS has impacted customers who are not in those tiers. Does SDG&E, are all of the PSPS events in tier 2 and tier 3 in SDG&E?
So I'll have Sarah come in on this one too. Well, actually, she didn't come on the last one, but I think we've had 1 or 2 small events, large events where 1 or 2 circuits that were not in tier 2 were affected by PSPS. Sarah, can you chime in on that one?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact details, but I think the way to try to understand this is there might be devices that are de-energized in the HFTD in tier 2 or tier 3 that may impact customers outside of the HFTD. And that's really handled by how we're looking at the customer impact. So we're capturing all downstream customers. I think it just, when we try to do the math and do the RSEs based on tiers, we go by where the device is located, but we do take into account all the customers downstream of a device, whether they're in HFTD or non-HFTD. So it's really more about where the device is and where the customers are, but the customer impacts are all encompassing.
Okay, so you are including non-tier 2 and tier 3, even though you're kind of categorizing them as tier 2 and tier 3, if I kind of understand it correctly.
Correct. Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
And then one of our questions had to do with in our prior to this workshop, we had been asking if SDG&E could discuss the cost risk reduction RSEs for each of the mitigations. Is SDG&E, I see this chart, but what I don't understand is what the comparative RSEs are for each of these. Will that be later in this presentation?
Actually, Chris, I don't think we threw that in. That's in the ramp. These are the IDs that are in the ramp on our RSE summary table. So if somebody on the team can get me the exact page in the ramp chapter, we can reference it. But yeah, we have the RSEs for each of these broken out just as they're shown here.
Okay, one thing I don't see on this chart is that I saw at the SDG&E gave a presentation on PSPS at a commission meeting, and they had also shown for the wings model bare wire mitigation, covered conductor, and undergrounding. Like for example, 2020 to 2022, they showed 235 miles of bare wire. Is that, do you have RSEs for that? And we were looking for more of a discussion on those kind of things as part of this workshop, like to be able to understand what SDG&E has for those, and kind of like how they then chose among those different mitigations.
So
Yes.
Chris,
Oh, yeah.
oh, just real quick, I think it's important to kind of remember the timeframes here. The 2020 WMP covers 2020 through 2022. The ramp covers 2022 through 2024. So there are some things you're going to see in the WMP that you're not going to see in ramp, but there is an overlap of 1 year. And in the ramp, we did provide the risk spend efficiencies by tier for all those programs. So you'll have the bare conductor hardening, you'll have the covered conductor, you'll have the underground. Does that help?
To be honest, it does show, like, 2020 to 2022, bare wire being 235 miles, and then minimal miles is what was said on the presentation before the commission for bare wire for 2023, 2024 going forward. So I understand that there's information in the ramp. We were looking for this workshop to kind of have a discussion about what those values were and why maybe SDG&E chose some and not the others, and to give the big picture, comparison of those sort of RSEs and mitigations. So for example, it looks like from the commission meeting, there were going to be, a large number now miles of covered conductor and undergrounding beginning in 2023, and none on bare wire. And just to kind of have a discussion here or a presentation to explain how those selections were made was one of our, what we were hoping to get out of this.
Yeah, so Chris, sorry, Mason, do you want to say something before
No,
I
go
jump
ahead.
in?
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I don't think that was necessarily on the agenda, but I can try to give you the bigger picture, and then maybe we can follow up with through discovery, as Joe mentioned. There's a little bit of history there and a transition that Mason touched on. So historically, we were, and I think Eric even mentioned those programs, Firm and Prime. We had those programs since, I think, roughly 2014. And so that predates a lot of the latest MABF stuff and modeling and risk spend efficiencies. Those programs were lumped into this bare conductor hardening bucket. The history for those programs is that we were targeting specific assets for replacement. So with the Prime program, we were looking for pole health issues, and we were identifying specific poles that needed to be replaced or reinforced, and we went out and did some projects there. In the Firm program, we were looking at conductor risk very specifically, and we went out and targeted small copper wire in the Hftd to really reduce the risk of wire down and other types of conductor events. So it was really asset-based analytics using tools, again, that predated MABF. So there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about, the reliability, financial safety, and divided by the score and risk spend efficiencies, but we did have a lot of risk calculations behind those programs that helped us prioritize and rank how we were targeting those hardening efforts. In 2020, we started to shift towards more resilient approaches and more comprehensive grid hardening strategies, specifically geared towards applying covered conductor and underground on whole segments. And really that shift was because we started to incorporate PSPS in the mix and start to kind of take a step back from the asset point of view. And because we were doing asset by asset, that meant that some segments had some assets that were hardened and some assets that were not hardened or not prioritized for hardening, at least in the first few years that we were doing the work. And so we were in situations where when it comes to PSPS in customers, we have a segment that has a mix of, for example, wood poles versus steel poles. And when we operate PSPS, we have to think about the weakest link. And so in order to shift our strategy to really incorporate PSPS in the mix and try to continue to target the fire risk reduction, but also gain some PSPS benefits, we shifted to the segment level of granularity, where we're looking at an entire segment, all the assets in that segment, the vegetation, the wind conditions, the PSPS history. And because covered conductor offers more risk reduction specifically for PSPS, we see more potential with being able to operate those segments at maybe higher wind speeds, because we're less worried about things flying into the lines because their lines are covered. And so that shift in strategy started to happen in 2020 is when we developed the WINGS model. We started looking at things on a segment by segment basis. There's also a time lag between when we do the modeling and when we develop the scope versus when projects actually get implemented. So a lot of the scoping that we're looking at today, for example, in WINGS for covered conductor and strategic underground is not going to go into place until 2023. So there's a little bit of a shift, but we definitely went from bare conductor hardening and shifted over to covered conductor and strategic underground. And that's why you see those numbers drop in the bare conductor targets and start to increase on the covered conductor and strategic undergrounding front, so we can tackle both the fire risk and the PSPS risk. I hope that gives you the bigger picture, but feel free to ask additional questions.
Thanks, Sarah. And so I would just, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the bigger picture. I guess if we're keeping like a whiteboard for, you know, follow-up topics, as I think Fred was suggesting at the beginning, then I think one topic that would be of interest to us would be to have those numbers, the RSEs for these different mitigations, to understand, you know, where you're moving away from the bare conductor and that kind of stuff. One other quick question is, if we go back to, please, to slide 7. The estimated average duration of each customer's PSPS. So in this analysis of the harms or the impacts of PSPS, it looks like it's looking at, you know, duration of customers' PSPS. And I think, Mason, you explained that, you know, there's a range. Sometimes, you know, there's a couple of days. Does SDG&E, can you discuss if SDG&E parses that out, you know, and looking at those extremes to then target the mitigations towards those extremes, those pockets of customers that have the greatest impacts?
At this point, we do not do that. That's something that we know we want to do, both in the risk scoring and you know, going forward, where we would use that risk scoring. For example, Chris, what I think you're saying is, if we knew there was a second, I always go back to if everything was the same. If one segment was going to have a 40-hour PSPS and another segment was only going to have a 6-hour, we should show preference mechanically to the one with a 40-hour. That's definitely in the mix. Right now, we don't see too much data to support that one segment would be longer than the others, but that will be coming into the mix soon. As of this moment, we don't do that. And in addition to that, and I think I talk about it in a future slide, is we're diving into customer impact overall, and we haven't made all the full progress yet. I think you've heard us say the same thing before, that we're going to be working with outside groups to understand how duration does affect the valuations, the negative sides of impacts. Repeat customers. I had a PSPS just 2 weeks ago, and now you're doing it again. Right now, we don't fully understand exactly what that looks like. And we're working with outside entities. And I don't want to speak for the other IOUs necessarily, but we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to reach out to groups to better understand all the types of things. And I think I have a slide on it, but all those types of things, including duration, that would impact PSPS. And then that consequently would feed into the risk prioritization through the RSE approach.
Thank you, Mason. I know we have limited time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mason, this is Tom. Can I ask a couple questions?
Go ahead, Tom. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Could we go back to slide 8? Thanks. So the first mitigation listed here is covered conductor for tier 3. What is the impact? Is the impact on PSPS from this to the lure, to the PSPS lure, the PSPS core, or where is it?
right now these would be to, well, the top one for a cover conductor and the bottom two for strategic undergrounding would be to the core. And the reasoning is we've looked at the specific, like Sarah's team has figured out exactly which circuits we want to do the work to. And we've determined that even if we do the work there, it's not going to remove an event. The other people will still have to go through the PSPS. So we're trying to reduce the customer count when it does occur. So that's the core movement.
Okay, so looking at your work papers, it looks like the impact is negligible for a covered conductor for the core. Is that right? It's 0.01.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't use the word negligible because I've had access to like all the circuits, and I do know on some circuits it has significant change in the PSPS, and I don't have on my memory exactly what the impact is on these circuits, but there's certainly times where it doesn't have as much, and most of the cover conductor helps the wildfire piece, and then other circuits you'll have where it helps the wildfire piece and the PSPS. So just to walk through that, Tom, I think maybe Eric was asking a similar question. We have in our mind like how often we would need to PSPS with its current configuration, and if we cover a conductor, we know what the wind is in those areas on each circuit. So we'd say, okay, with cover conductor in place, how many times does the wind get to that level that we think we can use to cover conductor for? And that's how we do the reduction in the likelihood of a PSPS event.
Okay, but again, you said the impact for the ramp scoring purposes is on the core side, not the lower side. When we're talking about, yeah,
for system hardening for PSPS impact, yes, sir.
It reduces the scope of a PSPS event, right?
Yeah. Now,
okay.
However, as we go further and further along into the mix, we may find that, hey, you know what? There was a few events that only affected a few circuits, and if we do work on those circuits, we might find that the lower for 4 might drop to 3. So it's a we try to look specifically at the circuit we're talking about and see how it impacts the PSPS events overall. So it could be lower in the future.
Yeah, so that's when I'm looking at this work paper, it's the aggregated percentage impact for tier 3 and tier 2. For tier 3, it's 0.01%, so negligible, and for tier 2, it's 0.00%. But that shows the value of more granular analysis, right? Because when you look at it at a segment or circuit level, you're going to see that some segments or circuits might have a more significant impact, right?
Correct. Oh yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Hello, Mason. This is Joe Mitchell, MGRA.
Hey, Joe. Dr. Mitchell. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. PG&E recently did a public announcement of a 10,000-mile undergrounding program. Your strategic undergrounding program, when I looked at the overall numbers, actually it didn't look that different. About what fraction of your risk of the HFTD are you looking to underground in the long term and over the course of this ramp?
I'm gonna defer to Sarah because she remembers the long-term roadmap better than I do. But just to clarify, before she joins on, the way we're looking at the segment by segment level data in Wings is saying, what should we do on this segment? Should we do anything at all in terms of system hardening? Should we do cover conductor? Should we do undergrounding? Can we do some partial? And so we've done an early assessment on every single segment in tier 2, tier 3, and some extras in non-HFTD. And we have an early idea of what we could do with those. However, reality being what it is, we can only do so many a year. And what we're focusing on in 23 and 24 is what we can do in those years, given our resources and given budget constraints and permitting. There's lots of environmental. So what I'm trying to say is we think we have a really good idea that the circuits that we want to do in 23 and 24 are very good circuits to do work on. However, in the future, as Wings modeling matures, we'll have more time to evaluate what we want to do on all the circuits. So having said that big proviso, Sarah, do you recall at all about what fraction of our system the current Wings model says to underground?
I was trying to do the math in my head, which is not a
I was
Not
trying to buy you
putting on
time.
the spot. I appreciate it.
Sorry.
Bigger picture, I think, Joe, I think it may be important to just note that for us, we're not setting kind of a broad target like that. We're really targeting where we want to do the work that's going to get us the most benefit and get us risk reduction for, I guess, a relatively good cost benefit analysis.
I understand that, and that's why I'm asking is that if this becomes a thing or a political trend or something that if PG&E goes and does it, then people are going to be saying, well, why don't the other utilities do this too? So where are you now with respect to undergrounding and your plans for undergrounding versus what an equivalent program would be if somebody said, oh, go all in on it?
Yeah, so roughly speaking, in the long run, and we're talking about what I know today, August 2021, things might change in the future, but what we've been talking about internally is roughly undergrounding about 600 miles in the long run. It kind of depends on how you look at it, how much overhead you convert versus how much of that overhead is going to end up being underground. Sometimes rerouting can add some miles here or there, so there's a range around it, if you will. And then covered conductor is about 800 miles in the long run, and I'm talking about potentially a 10-year strategy. I don't have the exact numbers in the ramp off the top of my head. I should have those memorized by now. But that would be basically what we're looking at in ramp. I think for 2022, we're looking at 80 miles of underground, 125 miles in 2023, and ramping up to 150 in 2024. And then covered conductor, as we scaled back, the bare conductor hardening is going to ramp up to about 100 miles a year. I don't think it's 300 necessarily in the 3-year time frame, but that's roughly around that. Again, it's a targeted strategy. We're not arbitrarily saying we want to underground a big portion of the HFTD. We're really being cautious about where we think the work should go based on risk. I'll pause here. I don't know if Sean is on the line or Jonathan, if there's anything else they want to add.
Yeah, I'll just add, that we're trying to look at our system and our situation with our equipment and our risks. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, can you just remind us how many miles are in your HFTD?
We have of distribution, we have about 3,500 miles of overhead.
Okay, thank you.
Sean, did I hear you coming in or?
Yeah, Nathan, I was just going to reiterate what you said. We look at our equipment specific to our known local conditions and our risk and consequence, and looking ahead, just like Sarah mentioned before, and in the ramp report, I think did a good job of explaining how and why we blend covered conductor and undergrounding the way that we do.
This is
Melinda Dickinson.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. And with respect to the roughly 600 miles of undergrounding and 800 miles for covered conductor, is it there aren't any overlapping miles in there, or are there? Are the 600 miles for undergrounding for sure not being considered for covered conductor?
Correct, yes. The way we're setting up the strategies, we're picking either underground for certain segments or covered. It's not looking at doing covered and then changing to underground. We're really trying to think ahead as much as we can.
Okay, and then the follow-up to that is how many miles of the undergrounding and how many miles of the covered conductor have undergone the wood to steel pole mitigation that is no longer the focus?
I don't have the number off the top of my head. Was there somebody that was going to chime in?
Yeah, this was Joe, and I just wanted to, when questions are asked, if they could clarify if they are questions specific to what we performed in the ramp versus questions that they're asking that may be for years that are beyond what we covered in the ramp.
You're asking for me to, I'm asking a follow-up question to try to
The
understand
600
what's going on in this workshop. So my understanding is the answer was that you don't know. Is that right?
Are you,
No.
I think Joe's clarification is worth tackling. Are you talking about the 3-year time frame in the ramp?
What I was specifically speaking of is what you were speaking of, which is the, I believe you said 10-year, I don't remember exactly the term you gave it, but you were talking about roughly undergrounding 600 miles in the long run and 800 miles for covered conductor. And so my question is, how much of that planning, which my understanding is applicable now, how much of that is, or I guess I should start with the question, have you even considered whether a particular segment has been converted to steel poles in coming up with your long-term planning?
Yes. So every segment has a risk assessment that took into account how much hardening we've done in the past to calculate the residual risk that remains, because previous hardening doesn't eliminate the risk, as we all know. There still remains some risk. And so it's really using that as a baseline to then figure out how much risk do we need to tackle in the future. We're not saying we're going to redo a whole lot of work that we've previously done in the past, but that's something that we're carefully considering in the context of how much the risk is increasing over time, how much fire risk we need to mitigate, and also how much PSPS risk we can reduce without doing some rehardening, if you will. And we're trying to figure out what is the right number, and there isn't really a right number, but we're trying to be strategic about this. Without doing some level of rehardening, it's really hard to achieve those PSPS reductions for the customers that get impacted the most. So there is a necessity to do a little bit of that, but we're not saying everything we've done in the past, we're just not gonna, we're gonna scrap that and redo a lot of it.
Joe Mitchell, just doing a quick follow on to Melinda's question. So if you are redoing a hardened line that has steel poles, if you put covered conductor on that, are you going to need to do any further pole replacement or hardening, or does the existing infrastructure support covered conductor?
That's a really good question, Joe. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, this is Sean. I can take that. We will be redoing the pole loading calculations to see and ensure that the existing structures can support the additional weight of the covered conductor. In our experience, most of our steel poles do not need to be replaced when going from bare wire to covered conductor, but I can't say none because I'm not sure of the exact number, but we will be doing those calculations to ensure that the pole loading is still within our specifications moving forward. And then if I may, I just wanted to clarify something on the previous question on the hardening. When we're looking at the ramp time frame, none of the undergrounding or covered conductor is items that had previously been hardened. And to add a little bit on to what Sarah mentioned before, moving forward, that is certainly something we would consider when scoping those projects out beyond the ramp kind of time frame.
And I'll add that
Thank you for that Go ahead, Mika.
Sorry, Melinda.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm interested to hear what you had to add, but
yeah, I was going to say I'll add that the wings work that we do, and maybe we mentioned it already. It is, it's an analysis, but it shows what we think we want to do on a particular segment. but then that segment is handed over to an engineering team that has expertise in design, and they're going to do those load calculations like Sean was talking about, and they'll incorporate real world constraints and real world information. And then we will update the analysis with what they find. You know, we can't do all the granular permitting work until we get to a certain point, or the pole loading calcs, for example. When Wings might propose a segment, and then it gets handed to a team, and they will reevaluate it for, okay, how many of these poles do we need to replace due to maybe some of the steel can't handle the covered, and we will re-input that into the calculation to see, is that still a segment we want to do, or is it all clear? So I just don't want people to get the impression that Wings says something, we're going to go do it, and we're done. There's many steps before it gets to the actual spend.
Thank you. So just to clarify, there's no miles that are proposed to be undergrounded that have been subject to the wood to steel program for the ramp timeframe?
Yeah, in this ramp timeframe, correct.
Thanks for the clarification. So do you guys also consider whether there is a undergrounding project in the relatively near future when determining whether to do something like covered conductor work?
Oh yeah, all segments get reviewed for whether we should do covered conductor or undergrounding. Essentially, we take where is the risk now in wildfire and Psps, and then we say what would it be if we were to cover conductor it, and what would those two values be if we were to underground it. We create RSCs for each of those analyses, and then that's what comes up with the solution that we propose.
And what about when you have, agreements with cities to do undergrounding more broadly? How does that come into play?
Yeah, at this moment, there isn't much overlap because almost all of our tier 2, tier 3 is not in a municipal setting. It's county or government land for the most part.
Thanks.
Sure.
Wendy, that kind of brings me back to the question I was going to ask, which is how much of your high fire threat district distribution lines are already undergrounded? You were saying you have about 3,500 overhead miles right now in high fire threat district for distribution. How much are already undergrounded?
That's a great question. I think we can get an answer for that one. It's not in the deck. Can somebody figure out that one? Wendy, is it okay if we come back to that? I think we're going to assign some homework on that one.
That's fine. Because and the point is basically kind of, it's connected to what you were just saying, Mason, is that in the cities, I mean, you are more undergrounded, like in San Diego, in the city of San Diego.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Right. And, but that's not where your high fire threat district doesn't, I would assume that's not in the high fire threat district, or is any of the city of San Diego in?
For tier 3, there is no San Diego City that I know of. It's almost all county. You also have to think about some of the reasons that things are undergrounded is there are conventions with the municipalities. There are some, when we do new work, we do undergrounding in the city, but out in the country, in the back country, we haven't, underground's not the default up to this point for new construction, although there are some neighborhoods that have been built as underground. So the vast majority of tier 3 is currently not undergrounded. There is some, and we'll get that number for you. I think it's as little as 20%, if not smaller, is undergrounded. And to this point, it wasn't specifically for wildfire purposes necessarily. It was a combination of the needs of the community. Okay, so when we get that number, Wendy, we'll get back. Oh,
Hey, Mason, this is Steve Hain from SPD. One last question. I noticed that the Zone 1 HHZ, which is part of the high fire threat district definition, is not included. Is it because it's included in the tier 1 and tier 2 areas?
Correct. All of our Zone 1 is in either tier 2 or tier 3. And if you look at the maps, we don't really have that much anyway, but it's already included. So we just treat it as part of the tiers.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, Steve.
Hey, Mason, this is Sean. For the current mileage within the HFTD, I think Sarah mentioned we have about 3,500 overhead miles. We also have about 2,600 underground distribution miles in the HFTD, which means we're currently at about 43.8% undergrounded in the HFTD as a total.
So yeah, that's HFTD. So that's 43% for tier 2, including tier. I think we were talking about tier 3 specifically, but that's a good number to have. Tier 2 certainly has more undergrounding than tier 3 does.
Yeah, I can break that out if you give me a little bit more time.
Yes, thank you, Sean, very much.
Yeah, I just want to clarify again. So the 2,600 is for all tier 2 and tier 3 at this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, for the interest of time, let's keep going for this PSPS risk assessment piece, if we could. Let's go to slide 9, please. Thank you. Real briefly, we want to just walk through one of those examples where there's a generator program, resiliency grant program. This particular program focuses on medical baseline customers, and we're proposing giving 2,000 generators to medical baseline customers. The other part of it is that it can only serve 40% of the customer load. So we're not saying it's 100% remedy for PSPS. We're only taking credit for 40% of it. So with that knowledge, the customers that we're looking at, we believe have an average of 1 PSPS per year for those particular customers. Don't confuse that with 4 system-wide. We looked at the customers themselves and there's about 1. The generator can last about 10 years per the specifications. So the general math is, 2,000 customers for 10 years, 1 PSPS reduced. So if you do that in your head, it's about 20,000 PSPS events that would be mitigated to some degree. And then because it's only 40% of that, it's the equivalent of 8,000 customers prevented for PSPS. So we take all that math, we put it in the mix, and we say that again, to Tom Long's question, this reduces the core. The PSPS reduction would be 70 points out of something like 4,700. So it's not huge impact, but for the cost, it does have a pretty good RC, 76. So this is an example of a PSPS focused mitigation that this one in particular only affects PSPS. We're not claiming that giving generators reduces wildfire risk at all. These are battery powered ones. So I just want to run that past you to see how we do the math on a PSPS mitigation. Let's move on to slide 10. And there'll be room for questions at the end of this section. And I think we've talked a lot about this already, so I'm just going to breeze through the WINGS model. The WINGS model looks at things at the system, the segment level, and a segment is defined as an operational segment between switches that can be used for PSPSing. And so we look at the assets in that segment. We figure out, or we estimate what the wildfire risk is depending upon the consequence if a wildfire would occur and the likelihood of it occurring based upon our assets, the wind speed, and some other things. And then we add those two together to say this segment has this much risk. And then WINGS, as we mentioned earlier, WINGS goes on to say things like, well, if we were to cover conductor it, what would the risk be on that segment? So it's a way of combining the MAVF method of taking the risks for safety, reliability, financial, rolling them, using that as the tool, rolling it together at the segment level so you can consider the impact from the PSPS side as well. As Sarah mentioned, in the older days, we were looking just at assets and we did a good job identifying some assets, but we still need to do PSPS. And so there was this a little bit of like, well, if you've hardened me, why am I still getting turned off? So WINGS kind of answers that question of trying to combine the two things together to find which segments to do work on, if any. Okay, let's keep going here just in the interest of time. Slide 11, please. Okay, and we've shown this before. Real briefly, this is an actual circuit starting in the upper left at that star. That's where the substation is. The blue is an individual circuit that goes through our system, and the little yellow dots, hopefully you can see them, are switches that are optional to us to do PSPS if necessary. There are 3 weather stations on this circuit marked by that pin shape, the yellow pin. In the upper right, there's a weather station that had a read of 83 miles an hour. That that station is called Hellhole Canyon. Gets very windy there. Our meteorology team figured out that it was very windy. We went and scouted it out. We agreed that it was, and we put a weather station there and a switch. You can see a little bit south of that red circle on the edge of the red oval. There's a switch there, and downstream of that switch is only 30 customers. Before we put in that weather station and before we put in that switch, there was another weather station lower, which you see is marked as 33 miles an hour. Can you imagine a 50-mile-an-hour difference in wind speed? And those are only separated by 1.4 miles. So what we did was we found a new switch to put in that allowed us for, yes, currently we do need to like if it gets to 83 miles an hour, we do need to shut off that part of that system, but we really only need to shut off the red oval, not the green oval. So we were able to put in a switch at that yellow dot between the green, that's not an oval, a green shape, and the red oval, and make it so that the 470 customers in the green area don't need to be shut off just because of the red oval. So this should give you an idea of how refined and granular we are with our weather stations and with our switches. Let's go to the next slide here. So this is a tool, it's called CHIMP, that we invented like 10 years ago. And basically what it does, it's a circuit isolation modeling program, and we call it CHIMP. You can see there's a little chimpanzee logo up in the far left. I wanted to really hit home that we know where our system is, we know where our customers are, we know the connectivity of our system. So this is a grid view of circuit 222. And for anybody who knows where Santa Isabel is, this circuit comes out of Santa Isabel right across the street from Dudley's Bakery. So circuit 222, you can see this kind of grid hierarchical form on the left. Those are all switches that can be used for segmentation for operations. We know how many customers are downstream of each switch. We know how many customers are in between switches. We know that, we just know what's downstream of what. And you can see this hierarchy view. We don't necessarily use this for all of our analysis, but it shows that we have the data to support tools like CHIMP and other tools. So when we say things like, well, how many customers are there between here and here? We know that data. We're not guessing. We have that data. Also, we know who the customers are. I didn't show it. I intentionally tried to keep this as anonymous as possible. If you look in the lower right, it says export downstream customers button. If I were to hit that button in real time, I would get a list of all the customers and the type of customer they are, whether it's commercial, residential, industrial. I would know something about their load. And we use this type of information to, to make judgments about PSPS impacts. So I just want to make it abundantly clear that we know where our customers are, we know what they're attached to, we know which transformers they're attached to, and we have the ability to figure out that kind of information. So, and also this CHIMP also shows you like the number of feet downstream. So in circuit 222, there's 271,000 feet of overhead downstream of that substation, for example, which if you do the math is almost 50 miles. Okay, next slide, please. And then here's more of a bubble view of that exact same circuit shown in a different way. And I did show this at another meeting, but I think it's worth showing again. We know the connectivity. So for example, if a weather station says we need to shut off 222.1370R, I don't have access to the pointer, I apologize. It's the one just upper right of the circuit breaker. We know there's 400 customers downstream of that. And so it's just another way of visualizing the connectivity of a circuit. And this is obviously not to scale. So let's move to the next slide, please. And this is kind of a review of this particular section, and I'll take more questions. I know we kind of went afield a little bit during the session, but we have 11 mitigations that we believe affect PSPS scores. 3 of those also have wildfire reduction, and those are the cover conductor and the 2 tiers of underground. And those 3 make up 65% of the total dollars in the ramp chapter. So it's a significant amount of work that we're proposing that have both PSPS and wildfire benefits. So we think it's easier for all purposes to combine the 2 together so we can figure out the benefit of doing work when they overlap. And it allows you to do specific wildfire or PSPS analysis, or you can combine it together like we do for wings. So if somebody said, okay, if you do this, how much benefit do you get from PSPS? We'd still know the answer. And if they say, how much do you get from wildfire? We'd still know the answer. And we can combine them together to get the RSE. So If you did keep these in different risks, like if we had a separate enterprise risk register chapter, which enterprise risk register ramp risk called PSPS, we'd still have to bring them together in the end to do analysis for these big three. So we think it's just a lot more convenient to put them together because there's a lot of overlap. I think this is the last slide in the section. Can you verify that, please? And I see Wendy's come on the camera. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, well, we can pause here for a second. Wendy, did you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, so in the PG&E ramp evaluation, and then also the Wildfire Safety Division, you know, previous evaluation of WMPs, basically it was stated that PSPS, that RC should not be used for PSPS because it doesn't include societal costs and impact. So are you basically proposing that the way you presented your ramp, you have included societal cost and impact, and that's why you can compare the two?
Yes, we do include all those things you mentioned in a PSPS activities.
And then are you including the same societal cost and impact for the wildfire section so that you can be really combining them?
Yeah, we're using the same attributes from the MAVF, safety, reliability, financial, and we're trying to determine which of those consequences occur for each either wildfire or PSPS, put them into the most usable fashion and go forward. So we do have a section later that talks about how we do the PSPS evaluation. So we can probably hit that when we get to that section.
Okay, that's my main question right now.
Okay.
Hi, Mason. This is Chris Parks.
Hi, Chris.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If we go back to slide 11, where you did the you added the switch. Do you have a general idea how much that cost? How much the cost of that switch was? How much that division was, and what the RSE was for this example?
So actually, that switch was added pre-ramp. That was added a few years ago. Switches are typically in the neighborhood of $100,000, give or take. Sean, you can, if I'm grossly off, please correct me. And then we also need to add a weather station, which has some value to it, as a cost to it as well. But based upon Hellhole Canyon's historical wind speeds, we had determined that the PSPS events on that are pretty regular, like maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So we were able to save those 470 customers and lower their PSPS to 0 or 1 a year on average. So it was a pretty significant impact for those 470. I don't have the exact RC in my mind right now, but that's the idea behind it.
And that is something that you're now doing for. Would you consider that a PSPS mitigation RSC, or are you combining it with wildfire to determine that in your methodology now?
Yeah, so on that slide we were stuck on for like 20 minutes. This is called the PSPS sectionalizing. So if we were to do that going forward, and there is in the ramp, there are a few sectionalizing switches we're proposing. When we do that work, we're talking about specifically where would we put that switch. I think, can somebody tell me how many there are? Maybe it's like 10 switches or something. Each one, we know where we want to put them. We estimate how many fewer people will have to see PSPS because of it. And then we run it through the MAVF as a PSPS change in core. So when you look at the work papers for the PSPS sectionalizing, you won't see any change in the wildfire lower or core, but you will see a change in the PSPS core because of reduction of the customer impact because of that switch.
Thank you. And if you go back, one last question on slide 9.
Sure.
So this RSE is based upon a 76.3 RSE, and that's based upon a reduction in 40% of households that do not experience PSPS events. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're saying there's 2,000 households, and they will all not have a PSPS event, but because the generator can only provide 40% of service, roughly, that was a conservative estimate. We're only going to give ourselves credit for 40% of a reduction from PSPS impact. You know, it's one of those things that these are batteries actually. So sometimes we're making conservative assessment that the battery might not be able to do the entire house. And we don't want to just say, you don't have to have PSPS because you have a battery. We wanted to be very conservative, say you can at least keep your refrigerator and your lights and some other things on, and it's not a full ride through for PSPS, but it's a partial. So that's where we came up with that mentality.
Got it. What I was trying to get a sense of is comparing this where you actually have put on your slides like a cost, an RSE, a risk reduction. If you were to do that for the switch, would it be very similar or very different for showing what that risk reduction would be, the cost and the RSE for the switch exam?
Yeah, so we do that to some extent when we figure out where we want to do the switches. So for example, if you wanted to compare, well, maybe your question directly, Chris, is what if you hadn't put that switch in? Maybe you just gave them generators, right? And made the same assumptions. So if we went back to slide 11, you said, instead of putting that switch in, let's give them generators and that they can ride through the power. We have a general idea of how to do those RSEs. I don't think in that specific situation we did, but going forward, we are thinking about the RSEs of generators as part of what should we do here? Is it something that we could do cover conductor, a switch, or a generator? That's not really shown too much in the past, but going forward, generator and generator rollouts are definitely taking that into account. Could we just put generators here? And would that be a reasonable alternative to the other things that we're trying to do? Generally speaking, from a big picture, we found out that generators are not a very good replacement across the board for hardening because the sheer cost and there's other things going on. So we have made those comparisons. And I think if you had specific questions about it, we could answer those.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not suggesting generators, I think, as an alternative to the switch, but it would be nice to understand what those numbers are. And at this point, I see it here for this example. I didn't see it in discussion for the large different lists and the different, I was just looking to kind of get the big picture comparison of those kind of comparisons.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's all in the ramp. All the things in that list are, we can show you where it said PSPS sectionalizing, what the cost of it is, what the RSE value, what the benefit is. That's all in the work papers that we've provided. And if you want, like a walkthrough with that at any other occasion, we'd be happy to go through that with you.
Yeah, and in fact, if there were a follow-up workshop on that, I think that would be very informative. Thank you. That's
sure.
Okay.
This is Melinda from Protect Our Communities, and I think that would be helpful for us as well. I was concerned by some of the comments that I just heard in terms of the idea that this has not, that providing generators to be able, that will be able to, or I guess, extend through the entirety of a PSPS event, that hasn't been considered because we have, Protect Our Communities have been recommending that as an alternative with detailed numbers and calculations in our WMP comments for quite some time. I know I'm looking at the 2020 comments, the April 7th, 2020 comments of ours at page 31, where we provide a detailed analysis about how providing battery storage capacity, at least in the tier 3 customers, solar plus battery systems would be a far more cost-effective approach than what SDG&E had proposed. So I'm concerned that hasn't been considered. I think that's what I heard you say, Mason.
Yeah, sorry if I was. There's 3 different grant programs, 3 different generator programs. I'm talking about one of them. Not all of them have the same 40% restriction. And just to clarify, we're not saying it can't run through the event. We're saying it only allows 40% of the power during the event. each of the 3 generator programs has a slightly different feel to it based upon some regulatory feedback and some other things going on from the grant side. And so I think we could have somebody from the generator program talk or answer questions. If you put them in writing, we could help answer some of those questions. But we definitely, I think we've looked at what you've described. What would it be like to have generators across the board, and what would those look like? We've done some of that analysis as well. Okay, what was the agenda? Were we supposed to be done with this section by 10? I don't have the agenda in front of me.
And I think it was 10:15.
Oh, okay. So we have another section, and that's talking about wildfire risk assessment. If there's no other questions about sort of our PSPS and how we handle that, we can move on to it.
Mason, I was
Ask
just
a
going
question.
to add, Eric, just a second. I was just going to add,
Mhm.
I think it was to Chris's comment about being able to compare RC values in dollars. In the ramp report, it's Appendix C-1, where we provide a ranking of all the mitigations by, it's ranked by RC value, but it has the RC value and the total dollars that were used in those calculations. And this one, you'll see the 7.9, you'll see the 76 in that table. Eric.
Sorry,
Thanks.
can you, would you mind repeating that page number? Sorry.
It's Appendix C-1. I don't know what page it is. It's Appendix C-1.
Thank you.
Just quickly, so I don't see anywhere else where I could ask this question. So I'm just curious, in the WINGS model that we received, I think has assesses like 1,000 miles or 1,100 miles of the HFTD. But you mentioned that the total HFTD overhead is 3,500. So is there a larger WINGS model that does assess all 3,500?
When you're referring to the 1,100 from a WINGS model that you received, are you referring to a response of a data request or from the work papers, or what is that?
Yeah, I think it was you might have provided in PDF, but in Excel, it was in a data request, just the WINGS like segment level analysis.
Okay. Sarah, can you comment on the 1,100? I think that was just, that was the part for the work that was associated to the ask, right?
Yeah, it is a subset of the broader WINGS spreadsheet. And as we mentioned, I think in our, when we provided that work paper, this is just kind of a best guess of where we think the work is going over the next 3 years, but that's still to be determined as a part of our scoping effort. But to answer your question, Eric, the spreadsheet we gave you is a subset of a bigger model that contains all 3,500 miles.
Okay, that's just good to know. I think we'll request that. And just a quick question on, you mentioned the undergrounding, that you already have 45% of HFTD undergrounded. How do you think about assessing like where we are on line down risk already, given that you've already I assume the WINGS model now doesn't include those 45% that are undergrounded because there's basically no wildfire risk. So how do you think about acknowledging the risk that we've already kind of addressed through that undergrounding?
Yeah, so I'll be very clear. That undergrounding was not done to reduce wildfire risk. That undergrounding, as far as I know, was built that way from the very beginning. So it's not part of the risk that ever existed. So the term buy down doesn't really apply in that situation. There's been very little underground. There's a little bit that's done for wildfire purposes, but that 45%.
Well, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter why it was done.
No, it does, because
so there's less risk.
Let me explain.
Well, Eric,
It's if it's a new neighborhood that hasn't existed before and we put it in as underground, that doesn't change the wildfire risk in any way. So I think what you're referring to is if something was formerly above ground and it was undergrounded, that would change a risk profile. But that's not the case for a vast majority of the work that was done when it was first built.
and just generally speaking, I mean, we start with a baseline risk, right? And that baseline risk is based on where we think the risk is today. So that takes into account what's already under, what is overhead, what are the conditions looking like, and that's what Mason's team does, is those Monte Carlo simulations to model what is the wildfire risk looking like as of today, given everything we've already done. It's not necessarily going backwards and saying there used to be an overhead system and we removed it and now it's this level, but it's the baseline risk already captures the starting point of everything
No,
in place.
I think that's right. And I think conceptually, just something I've been thinking about is we go into every general rate case as if like the world is starting anew and these are the only next 3 years. And I'm thinking even down the road from now, we will have done a lot of mitigations and spent a lot of money. And so we have to go back and think about, well, what have we done and how much of the total risk have we already addressed? It's just a conceptual thing that I think we need to keep in mind. And so the 45%, it's kind of like Joe's comment where PG&E is saying we're going to go out and basically underground 45% starting now, right? Whereas you guys, I realize it wasn't for wildfire risk. I'm just saying like a lot of it is already underground for you. So it's just a conceptual thing that I think should be part of this. And maybe it's more of an SMAP thing, thinking about like all the things we've done before leading into the next rate case.
Yeah, so I think I know where you're going, but the risk score that we're providing to you here is what we think the risk score is now. After everything
no, I hear
that's
you.
been and that, just to clarify, that in tier 3 about 20% is undergrounded. And as far as I know, maybe only less than 1% of that was undergrounded after it was already overhead. Almost all of it is upon new construction, because San Diego is a booming, we went from 1 million people in 1970 to over 3 million people now. Almost all of it was originally constructed as underground. So you wouldn't want to claim that as risk reduction in any way. So I just want to be really clear about that. Okay. So let's move to the next section, please, which is somewhere around slide 16-ish. Yes, methodology for calculating wildfire risk consequences. Once again, let's go through here and there'll be room for questions at the end. This is not as long of a section. So let's go to slide 16, please. There we go. So I like to call this the big picture. How do we do wildfire risk assessment? We looked at a top-down approach. Going forward, we are going to look at more bottoms up or try to combine more bottoms up. But right now, this is a top-down approach. It's been used at the company for a few years now, and with some modifications. So we're looking at historical fires that have occurred associated to SDG&E equipment, going all the way back to the 50s. I talk here about we use probabilistic. It's like, well, we didn't know exactly which data set to use, so we used a bunch of data sets. And we kind of created a probability distribution between several of them and Monte Carlo those up. And then, so we looked at ranges from the 50s till now. We looked at from 1970 till now. We looked at 2007 till now. And we looked at different variations of that. And then we said, well, things have changed since, that historical view. So we applied some adjustments to account for changes that occurred versus the average of that time period. And some of those adjustments were made to system hardening, climate change. Some of the fire areas had burned. We've made enhancements with PSPS and sensitive settings. So again, we said, well, we don't really know exactly how much these things have affected versus the historical averages of the time period I just discussed. So we did a probability distribution around those as well. Of note, I'll mention the climate change here. We are assuming there's a 30% increase in the lower for wildfire given climate change versus the historical time period that we were looking at. Is 30% the right number? No. So Christine and I put probably just around 30. I forget what it is right now, but we don't know what that number is. Maybe that needs to be reviewed in the near term. So we can look at those. I think the key here to the big picture is that nobody knows what the wildfire risk is. Nobody has a clue what the likelihood of the consequence of the next fire is going to be. We're doing our best. And rather than maybe focus on how our analytical efforts could be improved, we're willing to take other assumptions. So if somebody said, well, it looks like you're claiming a fire once every so often, what would it look like if you put in this? We can do that kind of analysis. I think the exercise that we're going to walk through is how we did it, just kind of review for, does it look close enough? And if anybody wants to make significant adjustments to it, we can do sensitivity analysis around those. So we did, like I said, stochastic approaches with the historical and the updates or the enhancements or adjustments. We then, when we did wings data, we said, what is the wildfire risk at this segment level using asset data? But in the end, it was all calibrated to the top-down model. So like the sum of the segments were calibrated to equal the top-down method. And like I said, in the future, we're probably going to incorporate some more asset level failure rate and ignition rate and update the model that way. But the top-down model is what we have so far. So that's the big picture. Let me dive into the details, and maybe we'll start clicking together a little bit more, and then we'll have time for questions. Although a little bird just told me that we're a little bit running late, so I'll try to speed up. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the overview here is, like we mentioned earlier, we broke down the risk into tier 3, tier 2, and non-HFTD. The risk scores at the top sum up to 11,768. The lowers also sum up to something which is 21.17. The cores don't sum up because those are the consequence if a fire was to occur in tier 3 versus a consequence in tier 2. So the wildfire risk core number 555.89 is sort of a weighted average of the consequences. So in the end, the overall wildfire risk score is a lower of 21.17 and a core of 555.89. And you can see the breakout thereof. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And how do we do this? This is more of the detail, and I assume that everybody has this deck, and I assume everybody will ask questions about it at some point if they want. But we've looked at, as I mentioned here, we've looked at data going back a certain amount of time. Here we say 1970, but that's just because the first big fire, the Laguna fire, Kitchen Creek fire was 1970, but we actually looked at data before that as well. And then, like as I said, changes were considered for historical differences. In the work that we came up with, the average expected value of the likelihood of a significant fire is about 1 in 15 years. After we took the historical and applied our adjustments to what we've done since the changes over that average period, 1 in 15 years. And I don't say that lightly. That's a number that means something. When are we going to have our next significant fire? It's not 1 in 15 years. We don't know what it is. It might be next year. It could be later this year. It could be 50 years from now. We have no idea. When you look at the distribution of our outcome of our models, some of the models say you're going to have a fire once every 5 years. Other models say you're going to have a fire once every 40 years. And 15 is just like that midpoint. There's a lot of uncertainty around when that next fire is going to occur. So to my point earlier, if somebody says, we don't think 1 in 15 is the right number, we don't think your analysis is very good, what if it's 1 in 10? We can run 1 in 10. It's not a big deal. The other catch is that because fire weather seems to be kind of clumpy to some extent, you could have multiple fires in 1 year. So it actually turns out that when you apply the 0.069 in a certain way, you can have fires a little bit more frequent than that. You can have multiple fires in the same year. So we did a little bit more analysis to say 0.069 is that there is at least one large fire, and you could have more than one. So that in the end, that does change what's the expected value, and it gets closer to about 1 in 10 years when you average it out, because you could have 2 fires in 1 year. And unfortunately, in 2007, we actually had 3 fires that would be considered significant all in 1 year. Let's go to the next slide, please. Similar to how we did the likelihood consequences, very much the same way. We looked at historical consequences. We tried to do a fit for different data that we were looking at. And right now we have a shape where you can see the parameters there. It's a gamma with those 3 and the 0.8 as parameters. And for interest, we showed you the shape and where the P50 is. When you multiply together the likelihood and the consequence, it's about $225 million a year. I know Dr. Mitchell on the call has suggested we look at the power law distribution. More than happy to do that. And in fact, I think we've already looked at that a little bit, and it didn't seem like it changed data too much, but maybe we weren't doing exactly the way Dr. Mitchell wants. So we're open to looking at different distributions for the consequence as well. When you take for the multi-attribute value function, it's not just the cost. We want to look at safety and reliability. For right now, we're using an assumption that for every $1 billion of loss, there's 4.25 safety units. That's up for debate too. Where do we get that number? We looked at some historical. Is it the right number? Not necessarily, but it's good for what we're doing. Again, if somebody said, "Can you change that?" we would be able to do that. And reliability. People seem to forget about reliability a little bit from wildfire. I think a lot of folks focus on, well, the reliability might be bad, which caused the wildfire, but these large wildfires have an immense impact on reliability to customers. Even if the customer's home didn't get burned down, they might be without power for many days. And in 2007, Jonathan, maybe you remember because you were living it, I think we had some customers that were out for almost 2 weeks, because you can imagine a really large fire taking out literally 100 poles between their service and the substation, and they can't get power until every single one of those is restored. The reliability can be very long and can affect many customers that frankly had nothing to do with the actual fire itself, but they got burned out. Their electrical system got burned out. So from the risk valuation standpoint, the reliability piece is actually, it's very not trivial. It's pretty significant. Let's go to the next slide. I think there's one more here. Yeah. In the end, this is kind of how we looked at tier 3, tier 2. I know there's a lot of numbers on here. This is almost like the interested reader will look at it on their own. I don't intend to go through every number on there. I want to make it very clear that we did apply a 5% adjustment factor to get us to 2022. We assumed that the work that we had done in 2020 would give us a 5% reduction. So there's actually a 5% reduction of everything I just said on top of, there's 5% on top of everything I just said, because we were in the middle of the year and we were doing things, and we think what that did will lower the score by 5%. So that's an additional 5%. That's, you'll see the 5% floating around here some places, but this is just some math to reiterate everything I've just said. In the interest of time, I'd like to go to the next slide. Is there one more in this section? Oh, there's not. So let's pause there, see if anybody has any comments, questions about the wildfire risk scoring section.
Hi, Mason. This is Chris Parks. You mentioned the significant reliability impact of customers put out when wildfire destroys infrastructure, and then you mentioned, I think, being out for up to, or maybe longer than 2 weeks. Is that then factored solely in the reliability? Is it factored into both safety and reliability, or how is that sort of balanced out in the scoring?
Yeah, the way we look at it now is if it's a reliability issue, loss of power, it's just in the reliability piece. The safety contains, the item is meant to contain, there was devastation to your home, or you were trying to get out and you got injured that way, separate from the reliability piece.
Okay, so the being out of power for 2 weeks is not looked at from a safety specific. It's categorized as a reliability.
Correct. And we can look into that. But from my experience in 2007, and I was around for that, a lot of the people weren't even at their homes because they was just devastated. So I don't even really know how to think about what that would mean. Obviously, we don't want people without power. That's why we made sure to value that in the reliability. But as to its safety piece, we'd have to think about if it needs to be included on top of the reliability, in separate than the ignition part. So yeah.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mason, this is Tom. Go ahead, Miles.
Miles from Cal Advocates. I had a separate question. You mentioned that you were assuming like a 30% increase in lore due to climate change and head change. First, I'm just wondering where that and like where that's reflected in the risk scoring work paper, or is it in any explicit way?
It's in the wildfire top-down model. That's where it's shown, and I'm not sure that was in the work papers.
Oh, okay.
Just in case you're curious, I'll the 30% comes from a study that the meteorologist team was working with some academic institutions, and they came up with that number. I don't really have a good sense of exactly where it came from or which time period it applies to. So that's where it is right now. And as I said, we're going to revisit that number. But I would like to reiterate, I'd rather focus not necessarily on how we came up with the end result, but if you want to change the results, we can do so. I think that would be easier than walking through exactly the rationale for every single one of our inputs.
Okay, fair enough.
Sure. Thank you.
Mason, this is Tom from Turn. The portion of the slide deck you just went through, that's all about the pre-mitigation risk score. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. What we were hoping we would be able to talk about today would be how you got to the post-mitigation risk scores, the change in lore, in particular for many of the wildfire mitigations, particularly the big dollar mitigations. I'm hoping there'll be time to do that today, in particular, and in reference to the work papers. I have to say there's some frustration, continuing frustration on our side that we're always rushed through these workshops. We can see there's great interest and people are asking really good questions, and yet the workshop time is always limited so that we're not able to get to all the topics that are germane. And so I sure hope we're going to have time to get into some of the, with particular reference to the work papers. If it's not in the work papers, then we don't know how to ask for a different scenario. We have to say, you did it. We need to understand how you did it in order to say, well, can you do something different? And if we don't understand how you got to those effectiveness values in the work papers, we don't know what to ask. So anyway, that's more of a comment, but I'm hoping there'll be time. I'm afraid there will not be, but we have a lot of issues about understanding how you got to the effectiveness percentages and values for these some of these mitigations.
Yeah, I think we'd be happy to discuss the topic to the point that all the clarifications made.
That would be good. I hope we can get to it today.
Okay, Joseph Mitchell again. Just a couple comments and would like your response. I've asked this question before about the bias in the ignition data set due to power shut off, and you know, we do keep raising this. It's not that ignitions were at one time a good predictor of fire risk. In PSPS world, they're not. And in fact, I think you made a comment earlier today that more wind doesn't imply more fire as far as likelihood. That's only correct under a PSPS dominated regime. If you're not turning off the power, yes, wind is extremely tied to likelihood. And if we could sort of tie back to the frequency regarding your Poisson distribution, the 1 in 15 years, and I think you're right. It's going to be very uncertain. We really don't know. But I mean, if we look over, say, 30 years of history, SDG&E has had 3 very significant fires in 30 years. The probability in a Poisson distribution that all of those 3 fires occur within 3 days is effectively 0. These are not Poisson distributions, period. They're not. That's why in SMAP we've been pushing for people to start looking at using weather-based scenarios to do the initial driver modeling. And that's something we would like you to consider is, and we've asked PG&E for this too when we did their ramp, start with weather events as the drivers, calculate how often they come in, and what their effect would be both on power shutoff and on wildfire and how those trade off. So it's really more comments than questions, but that's just what I bring.
Yeah, I gotta say, I don't want to sound ingratiating, but I think I've always agreed with everything Dr. Mitchell's had to say, and I totally agree. That's what we're trying to do in the long run. That's on the roadmap. There's time constraints and there's resource constraints. But for example, Joe, what we're looking at is what is the failure rate of particular equipment at different wind speeds. And then you do see that phenomena that you're talking about, which is, well, there's not very many failures above this one wind speed, and that's because it's not energized above that wind speed. So we are making an effort to extend out what it would look like beyond the PSPS wind speed areas to say what would those failure curves look like. So we are definitely making that attempt. It might not be exactly what you're referring to, but I think it's in the same vein. And we're definitely, excuse me, pursuing that route. And just so everybody hears it, we're also looking into, we do post patrols, post PSPS patrols, and we're trying to capture that data. Right now, it's a little bit early. We haven't seen, I don't think, a really strong case here or there about exactly how to use that for likelihoods right now, but we're definitely pursuing that as well. So totally agree that I don't know if I would call it a PSPS dominated world, but with PSPS in place, it is more difficult to look at the data, and we've tried to account for that in our modeling to some extent, but it's definitely something we're not going to sleep on that's for sure.
Thanks.
Okie dokie. Let's move on to the next one. I know I'm supposed to be done by 11, I think. And here we go. Assessing PSPS impact on customers. We did touch this a little bit, so let's go through this. Next slide, please. So the big picture, we use the MAVF to estimate PSPS impacts as well. I've mentioned that a few times today. We're looking at the impact to the customers from a safety, reliability, financial, stakeholder satisfaction perspective, just like we do for wildfire. So we're using that MAVF to help doing the scoring. We totally agree. It's very important to understand how PSPS impacts the customers. And there's two main purposes for it. And we're only going to be talking about the one necessarily today, but for long-term planning, where do we do hardening? Where do we do asset replacement? Where do we put in new switches? But there's also the component of the real-time PSPS consideration. And we're not going to get into that today because it's still pretty fresh, but we just want people to know that we're also looking into that. In real time, soon we will have something to say about in events. If we do a PSPS right now, it will have this impact on the customer. So those are two different things, and we're going to be focusing on the long-term planning for today. So right now, the consequences that we're using for PSPS are largely subject matter expertise. I showed you we have the data back when I showed you CHIMP and some of those other things. We know who the customers are. We know when they've been shut off. We know aspects about the customers. And so we have that information, but exactly how much safety and reliability and financial impact it has to customers is right now it's largely based on SME. And again, I don't want to speak for the other utilities. We're all in the same boat. We're trying to figure out what does that look like. We're looking at other big events that have occurred, like big power blackouts that have occurred in the Northeast and other situations to try to identify, well, what did happen when the power went out in those situations. But wildfire is a little bit different because there's a wildfire going many times. And so it's a little bit different. It's not just a blue sky outage. So we're still really working through that. And so like similar, and Chris Parks was kind of talking about this, it's similar to other electric reliability things. There are lots of aspects to the impact to customers that we as yet haven't taken into account, but we know we need to. And I have a little list here, the duration, the time of day, the repetition, like I was just out of last week, okay. Things about the customers, the ERT, the estimated restoration time, very important. Things like that really add to the story of how PSPS event affects customers. And we really want to get good at all of those things. And we're very open to ideas. We're working internally and working with the other IOUs and working with some consultants to try to figure out how to best value or evaluate the impact of PSPS. That's the big picture. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The result, after everything that I just said, if you take into all the information and break it down by tier 3, tier 2, you get those risk scores that are shown there. The total PSPS impact on the side is 4,690. The core for tier 3 is bigger than the core for tier 2. More customers on average during those events. And then, so there you go. Let's move to the next slide. Talk about some of the how do we what values did we use to look at? We broke the customers up into 3 classes. We know it's not the right one to do long term, but it's what we've done for this ramp. It's a really good start. And those categories are sort of, we call it non-critical. Let me go in the order of the red box. The critical customers, which you can see are the police, fire department, and things like that. Another one is called medical baseline. These are customers that have some kind of qualifying medical condition, and then non-critical, which basically means everybody else, and that could be a mix of even residential and commercial. So the small table on the right kind of shows that, like for safety, for critical customers, if you look at the under the safety, you see on the right side of the safety portion, it says total impact. You see 1, 20, and 5. So those are multipliers. If there's a critical customer that is going to be PSPS'd, we multiply the safety component by 20. And if it's medical baseline, we multiply it by 5. Where did we get those numbers? It was discussions internally. We try to use proxies, but again, those are early starts. For financial, we have multipliers of 1, 10, and 1. And for reliability, we have multipliers of 1, 30, and 1. So like I said earlier, we know who the customers are. We figure out which of these 3 categories they go into, and we basically apply these multipliers to that segment for when it's going to be PSPS. Okay, next slide, please. And then for the results for the core is $4 million per incident. It's broken out by tier 3, tier 2. There's a small amount of safety. We made some assumptions about, what is safety? And I think we could spend 2 days talking about what are the safety impacts from a PSPS. There's all sorts of it. That's what we're really trying to study. We know it exists. We know it's above 0. We just don't know exactly what it is. Well, we used it in terms of, we came up with an amount which is put into customer minutes. What a customer minute is basically, if you have 10 customers out for 30 minutes each, that's 300 customer minutes. We said there's a ratio of the customer minutes of PSPS to safety. Like, so for every this many customer minutes, there is a safety event. And that number is in the work papers. I forget exactly. It's like 10 billion. It's a small number, and it's based upon some research we've done with the Northeast blackout and some other subject matter expertise. Reliability is pretty much straight reliability. It's like they were out for this long, this many customers, with the multipliers that we mentioned before for medical baseline and for critical. Stakeholder satisfaction, we set it as a 10 for safety. For subject matter experts. Chris, I saw your camera come on.
Yeah, I had a question at the end of when you finish this segment, but I don't want to interrupt you.
Okay, I think that might be let's hit the next slide there. I'm trying to get through. Yes, okay, yes, so let's go back one, and then Chris, and I saw Tom, I saw your camera came on too.
Thank you. Can we go back to slide 22, please? So I'm looking at the last bullet, and you mentioned this, looking at how to assess the customer impact, many dimensions, duration, time of day, repetition, customer characteristics, estimated restoration time. Yeah, I know, like, there's medical baseline, there's access and functional needs customers, there's elderly who may live in, buildings where they have no elevator power if they lose power. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this, and you mentioned that it's on the roadmap. I was just curious, is that roadmap, is this going to come about in time for the rate case so that SDG&E can target mitigations to expedite and reduce these impacts on those customers who have the greatest impacts in the mitigations that are going to come forward in the general rate case? And if so, what is the kind of like that roadmap or timeline for that?
Boy, you're really putting me on the spot because I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. We're making progress all the time, but I don't want to commit to having something ready by the GRC necessarily. I think what we can do is go back and try to revisit what we think is a reasonable adjustment to make to these dimensions, and see what would be available by the time that we needed to do the numbers for the rate case, and maybe work with your office to see if you have any preferred. Maybe some of these dimensions are more important to you than others, for example, and maybe target them that way. I think, you know, this stuff it's fairly complicated. Every customer is a little bit different. Every circuit's a little bit different, and we don't want to generalize too much. We want to be fairly accurate. But yeah, we'll work towards that. I think maybe my regulatory team and I will get together with you or your representatives to figure out what that could look like.
Yeah, and I'm not just suggesting that it be Cal Advocates, but I think of the ramp proceeding as the forum where that can be kind of expedited and then made most effective in order to benefit the general rate case. Because we mentioned before, I think we've given a slide where if we looked at PSPS as a risk on its own, using some numbers in a different ramp proceeding, that it could very well rank like number 2, right behind wildfire itself. So, and having the greatest impact on greatest risk to customers. So we're just looking to get the, you know,
Right.
this is something that deserves, you know, a high priority, greater attention. So anyway, that's all I was going to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Mason, this is Tom Turn. I need some help understanding slide 24.
Okay.
This one again relates to pre-mitigation risk scoring. Is that right?
So these are the weightings that are applied per customer, and they are used both in pre and post calculation. So for example, if we said right now there's 1,000 customers out, well, what kind of customers are they? We would run it through this mix. And then if the mitigation said we can reduce that to 800, we would say, okay, what kind of customers are those 800? Run it through the mix, and then we would compare the impacts between the two. So it's applied in both the pre and the post.
Okay. Let's look at the safety column.
Sure.
You have headings: initial score, impact multiplier, and total impact. And you were talking about there being a 20 for the critical group of customers. There was a multiplier of 20.
Yes.
But your impact multiplier column says 1. So that confused me a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry. Let me barge in there. That was a holdover from another way of thinking about things. Those are all ones. So the initial score and the total impact are the same. So sorry for confusing people.
But but when you say, so the initial score for that group is 20 as opposed to the non-critical group is 1.
Yeah.
That means that if you model a safety impact to a, you know, an ordinary residential household, and then you model a safety impact to an emergency response provider, and let's say that for simplicity, let's say that the safety impact is 1 before you do any weighting. But then you're going to multiply the safety impact of 1 for the critical group by 20 because you give that a weight of 20.
Yes.
So the safety, and can you explain that? I'm not quarreling with it. I'm just trying to understand the logic behind it.
Yeah, the logic was behind it is if there's a circuit, think of it as this way: if there's a circuit that has 10 customers on it and they're all non-critical customers, we would say there's 10 here, and the likelihood of when we put it through the consequence, the chance that a safety incident would occur is those customers divided by, you know, what is it, 1 in 10 billion customer minutes. So for critical customers, if you had another circuit that had 9 regular customers and 1 critical customer, we'd say the math is now, instead of applying 10, we're going to apply 29. Why do we apply a bigger number? Because these critical infrastructure places are important to support the infrastructure of safety mechanisms. So radio towers, police stations, hospitals could, if those places were de-energized, we're assuming that they might not have the best backup for whatever reason. And so it could lead to more health and safety issues for the general population because those services were not available. So we wanted to give them more weight. Is 20 the right number? No, I don't really know what the number is. If people in the backcountry relied specifically on one cell tower, maybe that cell tower should be higher rated because they would need to know about, evacuation orders or something like that. So this is our attempt to show that when a critical infrastructure goes out, it has a larger safety impact to society than it would if an individual customer at home went out.
Okay, but again, safety means death or serious injury, right?
Correct.
So that means comparing critical and non-critical, it would mean, again, going back to my example of if there's a 1, that means there's either a death or 4 serious injuries under your index approach. And you're saying that a death or serious injury to an emergency responder should count 20 times the death.
No, I'm not saying these are deaths to the emergency responder. I'm saying there's a power outage to a facility that has critical infrastructure. So if a cell tower or a police station went out of power, those people would not be able to use their services to help the society to remedy their own fallout from either the PSPS or the wildfire. So for example, cutting cellular communication off would prevent many people from hearing that they need to evacuate, for example, and those people might just be sitting at home. So that's why we said it's very important to keep these critical infrastructure locations so they can support the societal safety. It's not necessarily them themselves.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand. So you're saying if a critical infrastructure element like a communications tower goes out, it's that could have 20 times the safety impact of a household's power going out.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, let me think about that. The other question is for medical baseline, do you use the numbers that you're using for medical baseline customers? Are those the actual people who are enrolled in medical baseline in your territory, or are they the eligible numbers? Because we've all learned that there are more eligible medical baseline customers than are actually enrolled in the program.
So that's a nuance I'm not an expert on. I just know if it's marked in our customer database as medical baseline, we assume it's a medical baseline. And I don't know if that represents eligible or actual. So I think somebody from the team can get to the bottom of that one.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Well, that's all I had. I think we're on break now. Oh,
it's Wendy. Yeah, I want to follow up. Yeah, it's okay. I want to follow up with Tom's question. I think what it makes me wonder is, are you including secondary impacts, safety impacts in this PSPS, safety consequence analysis?
Yeah, we're not generally applying secondary stuff too much, but when we say safety for PSPS, most of that stuff is secondary to begin with. So you don't have power, the power went out. What could cause safety issues, right? I think we've all heard examples. It's dark. I didn't have lights on. I tripped and I fell. We've heard people talking about the garage door wouldn't open. I couldn't get my car out. I couldn't evacuate on time. There's lots of things like that. I think some people would consider those as secondary. And then there's a second level of secondary. I don't know if it's tertiary, but if it's a critical infrastructure, now they can't support the infrastructure, and a fallout of that is that the resident or the human being doesn't get the message or the support that they need. And so secondary things from that. So I think there's kind of two different kinds of secondaries, and we didn't go out of our way to identify it that way, but we believe that's what we're talking about. When the power is out, just so everybody's clear on the call, like if a wire fell down and landed on somebody, or they touched that wire and they got electrocuted, we don't call that secondary. What we call secondary is, okay, the power's out now, and then because the power's out, something bad happened along the line. And we think that's what the majority of PSPS safety is a secondary notion. So yes.
And I'm sorry, Mason, are you saying those are what you are counting, or what you are not counting those?
We are, when we say for every this many customer minutes, there is a safety incident, we're talking about the secondary impacts to the customer for things like I just described. But again, there are no studies out there that we can find that talk about a good direct correlation between wildfire PSPS situations and safety. And so we're just making subject matter guesses, and we're working with those other units to try to figure out how to communicate the safety impact. We agree there's definitely safety impact for shutting people off. We're just trying to estimate what it is.
I think the question that comes to my mind is if you're including, I mean, I understand that I understand that why you're doing it for PSPS, but if you are including that kind of analysis, secondary safety impacts for PSPS, then shouldn't you also be including it for other risk, for the wildfire risk and, themselves and other risks?
I think that's a good question.
One big one for the wildfire that I've mentioned multiple times over the years is the air quality impacts, for example. It's a real obvious secondary impact, health impact, whatever. So, I mean, I'm just giving you that kind of an example.
Oh, so just to clarify, for wildfire, we do take into account the health of the air, or whatever the right wording is, by including the acres burned component, because that was meant to specifically be tied together between the pollutants in the air and the acres burned. So for the wildfire risk, we make some estimates about acres burned, and then we use an academic study that tried to sort of quantify the health impact of acres being burned. And we take a sort of generalized view of that, and we do include it into the wildfire risk for air quality.
Okay, but there could be other safety impacts that the kind of ones that you're including for PSPS perhaps may need to be addressed in other risks.
Can you give me an example?
I'm thinking on the top of my head, but
Well,
I mean, I guess, if the critical infrastructure example, perhaps.
I'm
You're
sorry to
saying-
break in, but we are going way past the allotted time
Okay.
for the break, and perhaps we can take up this question following the break, but San Diego specifically requested a break time, and we need to honor that. Could we amend it to a 10-minute break, presenters?
Or even 5 minutes, maybe?
Even 5 minutes?
Fred, I think 10 minutes is fair.
Yeah. And Fred, I would prefer if we could hit the vegetation stuff when we come back from the break and follow up on maybe sort of Sarah and I's section in the gap, because we really want to get to the vegetation people. They've set aside time today to speak at a specific time.
Perhaps, Rennie, you can follow up with a formal data request on your question so we can stick to the agenda topics here.
That's fine.
Thank you.
So 11:22, Fred?
Okay, let's do it.
Thank you.
You're such a wonderful boy.
So Joe, here's Fred. I noted Mason wanted to make some suggestions about arranging the next topics a bit. I'm certainly in favor of trying to get to the topics of highest interest. And I propose that we could trim our final wrap up to just a 10-minute period to allow as much time for the presentations as possible. So I think I think Mason had the idea of what he thought should be presented next.
Yes, thanks, Fred. Yeah, would like to go over the vegetation management as is on the slides. Michael will be talking about those. Before we do discuss those, we had a quick 30-second clarifying statement that we wanted to make with regards to some of the information we said earlier as to what was in RAMP relative to what we are currently doing based on some post-RAMP discussions. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So the break gave us an opportunity just to recognize there might have been a little bit of confusion, and we just want to be clear about the rehardening discussion we had earlier. There's a difference between where we were when we filed the RAMP and our latest thinking, because it's rapidly evolving. We're going through scoping and design for grid hardening right now. So things are evolving and changing. And so at the time of the RAMP filing, generally speaking, we were not considering rehardening for underground projects. We did consider a very small amount for covered conductor. I don't have that exact number right now, but where we are today is slightly different. As our teams started scoping projects for 2023, let me back up. We're talking about 22, 23, 24. 2022 does not have any rehardening. 2023 is what is being scoped at the moment, and our engineering team is looking at the circuits that are in scope and the segments that are in scope, and they're bringing up some good discussion points around, hey, there's a potential to reduce PSPS to customers that have been hit by it quite frequently if we do a small amount of rehardening on the underground side. We're really trying to limit it, and as of right now, and it's still evolving, so we have our target of 125 miles. So far, we're looking at a potential of rehardening 14 miles for underground to benefit a good number of customers, and I don't have the exact numbers. All of these updates that are changing as we go are going to be reflected in the general rate case, and then 2024 is still unknown. So I just want to be clear about that. We're not considering rehardening for covered conductor, but as of the latest effort that we've done, 2023, we've identified a small percentage for underground rehardening, specifically to target PSPS benefits to customers.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. And so now we have Michael. We can see him on the screen. He'll be the lead on our discussion with the vegetation management topics. Michael.
Thank you, Joe. Quick mic check. Can you hear me okay?
Can do.
Great, thank you. Good, well, it's good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael DeLeo. I'm the Wildfire Mitigation Program Manager for the Vegetation Management Department. So I'm going to just take a few minutes in the interest of abbreviated time to give you an overview of our vegetation management operations. Some of the information may be a little bit remedial, so please excuse that if you've heard some of this information before. And then certainly if there's any specific follow-up questions or data, we can provide those through any discovery process. Also, if we have sufficient time after this presentation, happy to answer any additional questions you may have. But I want to make sure I allot some additional time because it sounds like there might be still some questions for Mason. So with that, I'm going to get started. Next slide, please. So first, I just wanted to briefly introduce, just for context, the SDG&E's vegetation management operation. So looking at the map in the lower right-hand corner, this just gives you an overview of our service territory. The colored portions that are sort of that watermelon tannish color are portions of the HFTD, Tier 2 and Tier 3. Tier 3 being that central watermelon color, and then Tier 2 being that tannish color. It's about 60% of our service territory, and for vegetation management, we manage about 460,000 trees within our inventory, and I'll get into what constitutes an inventory tree here in a second. About half of our inventory trees are located within the HFTD, so we have specific and targeted approaches for how we're going to manage those trees and mitigate the risks that they pose when they're growing next to the power lines. The information on this slide is specific to the HFTD. So we have a database where we electronically track and record and account for all of the trees within our system. And again, I'll get into some details about that a little bit later. Within the HFTD, we actually do 2 tree inspections every year. And these inspections are spaced and scheduled. So one's about a mid-cycle. So about halfway through the year, we will do the second inspection for each of our areas. Now we break up our service territory into what we call vegetation management areas, which are just discrete polygons that break up the service territory into manageable sections that we can schedule for inspection and for tree trimming, such that we get through the whole service territory each calendar year. Each one of those activities includes pre-inspection, tree trimming, auditing, and the activity of pole brushing. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'll just be focusing on tree inspection and tree trimming activities. So with regard to the tree trimming operations, just generally for a scoping procedure, we remove all tree branches that are overhanging the primary wire. And what does that mean? So essentially, if you're standing underneath a conductor, primary conductor, and you look up, if there's a branch that crosses that vertical plane, our goal is to remove that branch, irregardless of the location or the position of the branch on the tree. So even a tree that's, say, 60 foot tall that has a branch that's coming out at an angle that's hanging over the power lines, we have a goal of removing that. Now, we've had this practice in place for over 2 decades now, so we've come a long way with mitigating all of our direct overhangs. We still have a few in the system. A lot of them are actually in our non-high fire threat district. The ones that we do retain, that is, that we do allow to grow over the power lines, are barely breaching that vertical plane, if you will. And we would only leave a branch if we are sure that the branch is not going to pose a threat to the power lines. That is, there's no structural defects that are apparent on that tree that looks like that branch could shed and fall into the power lines. Another component of our operations that we are still in the evolution phase right now is with regard to our vegetation risk index. And this essentially is looking at several different components of our system to determine where we may have the highest risk for a tree failure or a tree contact. And it's looking at 3 components. First and foremost, it's meteorology. So I think most folks know that we have a very robust meteorology department. We have a lot of data and history on wind speeds and wind gusts, exactly where these wind gusts are occurring within our service territory. For example, in the gaps between mountains or downslope from mountains. And we're also looking as a component of our vegetation risk index, our tree inventory database. So we are considering those 460,000 trees throughout our service territory and all of the data and attributes that are associated with those trees as a component of our vegetation risk index. And thirdly, we are looking at our outage history. So we track every single tree-related outage that occurs within our system. And we have a pretty robust database and history of all of those outages. We send a forester out. That forester determines if indeed it was a tree-caused outage, and then they look for the mechanics, sort of the whys and hows. The specific goal of that inspection and that investigation is to determine root cause and what are the mitigation measures and avoidance measures we can take to ensure that that tree or any other trees adjacent to it are not also going to cause an outage. So we look at those three components within the Vegetation Risk Index. Now, the VRI was built primarily and mainly in association with our PSPS operations. So it is a key element, it is a key attribute of the decision making for PSPS in the EOC during an event and in advance of an event. What we're looking at doing is taking this to the next level where vegetation management can actually utilize this information to inform us of additional operations that we may need to engage in to avoid or prevent or minimize hazards by line strike. That could mean achieving more clearances on the tree, or that could show us where we may need to do additional removal operations, especially on some of our targeted species. We are actually right now in the process of revising the polygons or the sections that make up our Vegetation Risk Index, and this is a reflection of the new and additional weather stations we have on our poles, so it gives us a little more granularity in our information. And we're also going to be applying this to our transmission lines within the high fire threat district. Next step. Next slide, please, Jim. So let's get a little into what the specific activity of tree inspection means. So we at SDG&E hire professionals to perform this activity. We hire certified arborists to perform our inspections in the HFTD. As I mentioned, we do 2 cycles of inspections annually within the HFTD. So of the 460,000 trees, approximately half are in the HFTD. So we're looking at every one of those trees at least twice annually. Some of those trees also being looked at again during our post-inspection and post-trimming auditing operations. But it's during the main hazard tree inspection patrol that takes place, what we call mid-cycle within the HFTD, that we're really doing a deep analysis and what we call a level 2 inspection on all of those trees that are not just within our inventory, but trees that are tall enough such that if they were to fail at the ground, they could strike the power line. So our inspection includes trees well outside of our easement or our rights of way. And we're looking at the backside of the trees. Again, we're focusing on our targeted species, and we're looking for any signs of defect, whether they're obvious, like dead or dying or leaning, or a tree that has a structural defect. Now, I mentioned targeted species. So we have about 100 different species within our service territory. We target for greater clearances those trees that have a known propensity for either fast growth or failure, or for example, palms with frond detachment. It's on those species where we try to focus our post-trim clearances to maximize the clearance so we can help reduce and mitigate the chance for any encroachment or fall into the power lines. So during the inspections in the HFTD, again, done by our certified arborists, they are looking for a tree safety, they're looking for the health of the tree, they're considering post-pruning, they're considering what's been done on that tree in the past, they're looking at those species potentials, and they're looking not just at the potential growth or the anticipated growth rate for those trees, but what's happening at the specific tree level. So for example, there's about 200 species of eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees are not native to San Diego, but similar to throughout California, they are a preferred species. Unfortunately, a lot of them grow or planted in our backcountry, so we have to have some, specific mitigation measures to make sure they're not going to be the cause of an outage. But not every eucalyptus tree grows fast, and really it's dependent on the site-specific conditions to determine, 1, whether a tree needs to be trimmed, and 2, how much clearance we need to get to ensure that tree is going to stay outside of the minimum clearance for the duration of the annual cycle. Next slide, please. So how do we track and manage our trees? So with nearly 460,000 trees and about 11,000 miles total of distribution transmission lines that we have to get through every year. Our inspectors, you have to walk, they walk most of that line. There's very few spans that we don't actually physically walk into, with the exception of those that we have to drive, or for example, our transmission lines in Imperial County where it's essentially desert and there's no trees. In those instances, we will generally fly those lines to do our inspection. So to be able to track and manage and record and report on all these species, we've had this database in place for about 2 decades now, and it's gone through a few evolutions. We had a new one this year. Our work management system is called Epoch, and essentially that consists of 2 different elements. The server side, which is where we create the work orders that we submit to our tree contractors and inspection contractors and the others, so they can use the mapping interface to do their inspections and record. So for all of the nearly 500,000 trees in our system, we have a tree record. Each tree record has a unique alphanumeric identification, and every single inspection activity, tree trim activity, audit activity is recorded in that tree record. So we know at any given time, for example, when was the last time this grouping of trees was inspected in the HFTD? And at that time of inspection, what was the clearance that was recorded? We can also track and record the amount of clearance that we've gotten on every single tree. So for example, if we trimmed a eucalyptus tree last year to 15 feet, and this year we see that it's becoming a little too close to the power lines, that would inform our tree contractor that they have to trim it further back. Maybe they need to make a cut that's further into the canopy of the tree, or maybe they need to make a cut in the tree that removes a stub. It would also remove any potential for regrowth. So we can use this information to inform us on all activities, what we may have to do differently or adjust to ensure we're going to be compliant and fire ready. All of our contractors record their information daily. This information is updated nightly to a server. So every user the next day has insight and visibility on all the changes and updates that were made the day prior. So again, very robust information, and we have any number of reporting capabilities to show the history of the tree, all inspections and all trimming. Also with our new system, we now have the capability to identify the specific and accurate GPS location, the lat long for every single tree. So that's going to help us in our future analysis for example, how we're engaging technologies like LiDAR to, with greater specificity, identify where the trees are relative to our power lines and what actions we may need to take. We also have the ability to capture and record more information regarding our customers. So a lot of our customers, especially in the backcountry, they are now used to our vegetation management operations. Sometimes they receive upwards of 10 or more visits every year. So they know what we're doing. So if a customer needs to know, for example, when are you going to be here, or I need an appointment, or these are the specific access or notification protocols, we can record that within the system, and our contractors have that at their ready to follow those protocols. Wanted to talk just a little bit more, just elaborate on our targeted species. So I mentioned, out of about 100 species we have, we target 5. And those 5 species are the oak, pine, sycamore, eucalyptus, and palm. So why those 5 species? Some of those species grow fast. They just have a propensity for fast growth, like eucalyptus that I mentioned earlier. Palms are another fast-growing species. Now, the trunk doesn't grow that fast, but the challenge with palms are the fronds that regenerate quickly and detach, and then are subject to the vagaries of the wind, the speed and the direction of the wind, and they can carry some of those fronds great distances. So we are trimming, for example, palms that may be 15, 20, 30, 50 feet away from the power lines. Sycamore are another potentially fast-growing species. They generally grow in the riparian areas where there's a higher water table. but they also have a propensity for failure. They're considered a softwood species. So, as arborists, we need to make sure that we understand how trees grow, what are their likely characteristics that make them subject to failure, and try to act preemptively to ensure that we're not going to have an issue. Now, we've had some questions in the past about pine. Why are we considering pine as a targeted species? One of the criteria that we use to determine targeted species is not only growth, but also the frequency of outages. So, based on our reporting and anecdotal information, we know that those species are pose the likeliest and the most challenge for us. So pine trees, even though in relationship to the total population of trees in our inventory is not very high, they do have a propensity for shedding branches. Now, most of our outages on pine, specific to pines, do occur in the non-Hftd and occur within species that are non-native to our service territory. For instance, Aleppo pine or Canary Island pine. Ironically, we don't see a lot of outages or fires caused by our native pine species that we see growing naturally in the high country, such as ponderosa pine or some of the Douglas firs or some of the other conifers that grow in the higher elevations. So one of the ways that we're looking at possibly modifying our targeted species is trying to get a little more granular in our species. That is, which ones really give us the most challenge and issue. And maybe we don't focus so much on the pine trees, but we do critically look at our overhangs and those trees that are growing directly underneath the power lines that essentially, they're not going to have a life underneath the power lines. And a great example of that are the palms. The palms grow, again, the fronds grow very fast. So when a palm is growing directly underneath the power lines, once it reaches a certain height relative to the lines, we're really out of options for continued pruning. So we're gonna have to either top that tree to effectively kill it or remove it completely. Now, with regard to our clearances, we have a specific goal of maximizing our post-trim clearances, especially on those targeted species. But it's not just relegated to those targeted species. Essentially, we need to apply that to any tree that's showing fast-growing characteristics or has some sort of structural defect or obviously is dead or dying. When we're applying our clearances, and we consider anything greater than 12 feet as being falling into our quote enhanced clearance category. When we're trying to determine what is the appropriate post-trim clearance for a tree, it's not arbitrary or capricious. We're not just saying, okay, we're going to measure out 12 feet or 20 feet and make a cut. We do have to consider several different factors, such as species, the growth potential for that tree at that location, what is the best cut for the tree to preserve the health, and also if there's any structural defects on the tree, we're going to have to cut the tree back to completely mitigate and abate that hazard. So a tree
I'm
that
sorry for interrupting. I just want to point out that we have a total of 5 minutes remaining for the entire workshop before we do our wrap up. So I just like to mention to Joe and presenters that it looks like this will be the only presentation we have time to wrap up on, unless there was something else you meant to throw in.
Yeah, Fred, thank you for that check-in. I am the last presentation, and we just have one slide after that, so I think we'll meet the time. Thank you so much.
Mike, why don't you jump to just the next slide and let people know how or if the vegetation is impacted by other mitigations. And in the while you're going, advancing 2 slides, Eric, do you have a question? I just thought since you showed yourself, I just want to make sure.
I did, but we're running out of time. I have another question on the next slide, so I guess we could do that first, and then maybe I can get that one in.
Okay, Mike, why don't you cover your 1 slide, then we'll go from there.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, everyone. We'll go on to the next slide.
One more.
Yeah, I think we just had 1 slide in this one. So we just wanted to broach this discussion about how does vegetation management relate to fire hardening. So fire hardening, when we think about wood to steel, cover conductor, or underground, obviously there's a relationship and between the trees and the adjacent construction or reconstruction. So when we think about trees that are adjacent, for example, to lines that are being covered with or the conductor covered, that doesn't necessarily mitigate or prevent or preclude the need for continued vegetation management. We still have to address any tree that could potentially fall into those facilities, and even if it's covered conductor, possibly bring that line down or otherwise affect the electrical infrastructure that could arc or spark. For undergrounding, we have to consider obviously constraints that are associated with the environmental risk and impacts. So even though undergrounding from a vegetation management standpoint may sound like the ultimate solution, you still have to consider the impact to the roots and the other impacted shrubs or protected species that may be directly under or adjacent to those lines. So vegetation is a component of the analysis when determining, is this really the best approach for mitigation or fire hardening? And we also have to think about, even if we're going to be undergrounding a power line, we still have to continue our pole brushing activity. So generally where undergrounding starts, there's usually a riser pole where the line goes underground. It usually has hardware that might be subject to the pole brushing requirements. The one thing that we are doing as a mitigation initiative with regard to our hardening is trying to identify instances where we are going to be replacing hardware that is subject to clearance, fire clearance at the base of the pole, and using equipment that is not subject to that. So for example, we have an initiative to replace a lot of our hotline clamps and fuses, most of which are subject to the requirements of PRC 4293, where we have to clear that base down to bare mineral soil. So we do consider and contemplate vegetation management, risk avoidance, and additional vegetation management activities that may be subject to fire hardening considerations. So with that, in the interest of time, I believe, Joe, that's the last slide. And well, I guess we'll stop there and see if there's any questions specific to vegetation management or revert back to some of the previous discussions.
Thanks, Michael. Definitely appreciate it. Fred, we'd like to, we'll field one or two questions on veg management.
This is Steve Hain here from SPD. I am still not entirely clear what is the what exactly is more done to those 5 species, targeted species. So let's say that, give an example, a redwood tree is not one of the 5. If it overhangs the power line, I mean, what's the difference? What would be the difference between the treatment of a targeted tree versus a non-targeted tree? Is it, do you trim more or more inspections?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. So I'll try to clarify. So one, I think, knock on wood, we have very few, if any, redwood trees within the Hftd. It's not a native species to Southern California. Difficult to manage because it grows so high. So what we are really focusing on the targeted species are their growth potential, and making sure that we are addressing any characteristics where they have a proclivity for failure. So some of our targeted species, like eucalyptus, like sycamore, and even some of the oaks, they have a proclivity for shedding branches and falling into the power line. So what we are obviously tasked and challenged to do is to manage the space between the overhead conductors and the trees. And you have to do that in consideration with the environmental factors, again, the site-specific conditions, and what we are doing from an arboricultural standpoint to mitigate that. So we mitigate that by increasing the clearance space between trees, any trees, not just the target trees, and power lines. Your example about the redwood tree. So I know in Northern California, when I used to work up there, it's a huge problem. They have high density, especially of their conifer species, and a lot of overhanging branches. So when those overhanging branches shed, which conifers, that's just naturally what they do. If they're immediately adjacent or above the power lines, then there's a higher likelihood they can fall and strike the line. So that's why we've had just a standard operating procedure for the last 2 decades of trying to remove most instances of overhead branches. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eric?
I wanted to go back to the last, the slide you're on, 32. Are there any benefits from a vegetation management standpoint for when you install cover conductor? Like, can you let the branches growing closer, or are there any benefits there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Eric. From a regulatory standpoint, there actually is an exemption if covered conductor is used, if it meets specific criteria for what constitutes tree guard. However, if there is any disruption in the covered conductor, then that line is potentially exposed to arcing. So from a management standpoint, if we have cover conductor adjacent to our trees, we may opt not to get as much clearance as we would otherwise do. But irregardless, if it looks like the tree pose a structural impact or threat, if you will, by virtue of breaking or shedding a branch that could mechanically bring down that line, even with cover conductor, we're still going to take the actions to get that type of clearance. And also, again, it's not an arbitrary clearance, so we really have to take the tree's characteristic, morphology, canopy cover into consideration when we consider, in a sense, where is that final cut going to be that's going to assign it the clearance.
Okay, thank you. And then another one is, let's say there is a program, like it sounds like that wouldn't really, in that instance, like save much cost for the vegetation management, depending maybe a little, but if there's a clear cost savings, let's say if you're undergrounding a line and you don't need to do vegetation management for a few miles, is that considered at all in the cost forecast or the risk modeling portion? Like, will you consider those savings? And you mentioned like the pole brushing is another example. Are those cost savings considered anywhere?
Michael, I can chime in here. This is Sarah.
Sure. Yes, sir.
I will say that we're at the early stages of starting to consider that. So some of the things we're thinking about including in the future is life cycle cost analysis. So when we scope a segment for underground, we're trying to better understand what does it cost us to maintain that segment today, and how is that going to change as we underground. I think, as Michael alluded to, even underground still requires some level of veg management because you still have some overhead structures, pad mounts, things that we have to still inspect through asset inspections or veg management inspections. So something we're looking at in the future, but it's not included at this time.
Okay, thanks. I had one other, but I want others to have the opportunity. So
Well, I'm very sorry, but we're really running out of time. And if we allow any more questions, we're just going to hit noon. And we do need to discuss a little bit about how to address remaining questions and topics that we couldn't even get to today. I know earlier Tom expressed a need to go deeply into the RSE calculations, which we did not touch on at all today. The options before us is to use the data request / discovery process, which means that there's a delay in the turnaround and only the one party requesting is going to really be aware of the response, even though we're also asking the utility to post their data request publicly on their website, so that information could be available to other parties. Another avenue is additional formal workshops of this kind. The problem is that we have a 12-day advance notice requirement. So any workshop that I schedule as hosted by SPD takes a considerable amount of time lag between the time that we start arranging it and the time we can actually have it. a final option might be less formally for the utility themselves to offer to hold workshops, which would not be under the formal noticing requirement of the commission. So I think those are our available options for obtaining more insight and more information. Does anyone have a yet another suggestion of a route to take?
This is Tom from Turn. I was on mute. I don't have another suggestion to add, but I do like the idea of, I mean, my preference would be, I guess, one that wasn't in your list, to be honest, is a continuation of this workshop. This 3 hours was useful. A lot of interesting things discussed. It didn't come close to addressing the issues that we want to talk about, which is the reasonableness of the calculations of RSC. It just didn't get into that, and in particular, in relation to what SDG&E has presented in its report and in its work papers. We just still don't understand a lot of what's been presented. This workshop basically glossed over the top of that. So it wasn't useful to us in meeting that portion of what we were hoping we would accomplish in today's workshop. Can we just, is there such a thing as a continuation workshop that we can just next Tuesday or Thursday or someday we can say we didn't quite hit everything we wanted to hit with this wildfire workshop. We're just going to continue this and do another 3 hours on someday next week. Is that an option?
I will pursue that. I believe we might be able to call it a technical working session instead of a workshop, and perhaps not have to meet the commission's requirements for formally noticing a workshop. And yet, obviously, we would be noticing all of the parties on the service list that we're going to have a continuation of this workshop. I'll check with legal to see if that's okay. I don't know why it wouldn't be, but is there
Fred,
any...
I'll just, the one concern for my team is we need to know what topics to cover. With regards to Tom saying he has questions on the follow-up questions on the wings, that's certainly understandable. And as Mason said, we are more than agreeable to have workshops to go over that. But we need to make sure we have the right people available, and we need sufficient time to prep. I mean, to say we're going to have a workshop next Tuesday, which is 4 days from now, it's not viable. It's not going to work. Our team, they're not just here waiting for workshops. They have other jobs, and they need sufficient time to prep. And so we need to have some clarity on what will be the specific topics that we're covering. That is our one main ask. We can schedule them. I'm okay not scheduling something with a 12-day advance for SPD's purposes, but we need to know what topics.
And Joe and Fred, what we would like, just to be clear, what we would
and I'm sorry, but it is 12 o'clock. Our members do have other commitments that start at 12 o'clock. So, I mean, for the sake of 12:01, but we do need to end this call. I am sorry.
I've never been in a workshop where there's an abrupt ending like this. This is the second time in a row. I do not understand this at all.
Yeah, and you're not posting data requests either.
I would like us to continue and finish off this discussion. There's a filibuster aspect to these things that just is not good.
I will stay on.
Consideration to the participants here. That's we told people we're going to end something at noon, and people need to get on with the rest of their day. I would say
I can stay on, Tom. I'm just saying the rest of my team is not necessarily going to be able to stay on.
Well, I'd just like to have a discussion to answer your question about what we would like to cover, and so if I could, I'd like to address that.
I appreciate that, and then also we need to give other parties opportunity to provide their thoughts for follow-up workshops as well.
Of course, that would be a good thing to talk about. Right now would be a good time.
And this is Commissioner Houck. I would like to hear what the other parties would like. I would like to hear what Turn and the other parties, the information they'd like to explore.
It's fine with me. I just know that in the past we've had people make formal complaints about running over time, and I'm trying to be sensitive to that. I have no trouble myself. Let's go for it. If people complain, they complain.
I've never complained that way. I'm not familiar with that. But anyway, thank you, Commissioner Houck. If I could speak to what Tern would like to see in a workshop of some ilk in the near future, I'd like to do that now.
Go ahead.
Okay. What we would like, and I'll start with the wildfire risk, is to have somebody, one or more persons from SDG&E who are intimately familiar with the work papers, who are ready to talk about there's the level 2 work papers and the wings model work papers. We would like to understand in particular and ask questions about the details of how the effectiveness calculations, the mitigation effectiveness calculations were performed. We're especially interested in covered conductor and undergrounding, but we'd like to be able to ask questions about other mitigations as well. But most of our questions would relate to covered conductor and undergrounding. We came today prepared. Dr. Lesser is on the line. We came today prepared to ask questions based on those work papers and never had a chance to ask them because it just wasn't covered in the workshop in discussion today. We'd also like I have questions about vegetation management. There are some effectiveness for tree trimming. The percent change in lore is shown as greater than 100%. I don't understand how that happens. I'm not expecting an answer now, although I was hoping we'd get to it today. So vegetation management, I have questions about how the effectiveness, what the effectiveness calculations mean, how they were developed, and how they relate to the ultimate RSE score. In addition, we're still quite in the dark about how the wings material rolls up to the general calculations of RSE and how those are reflected, how they relate to each other. So those are things that we'd really like to talk about. I think that would be a rushed conversation does not work. I think to have a good conversation about that's 3 hours. And it doesn't need a lot of presentation from SDG&E. You see, whenever these things happen, there are lots of people that have questions. You can just open the door to a topic and we have lots of questions. I would appreciate it if we could have an opportunity to ask our questions.
This is UCAN, Eric Wojcik. We fully support Tom Long's requests and agree with the points made. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Joe Mitchell, MGRA. Also, we support Tern. Just pointing out that during the PG&E ramps, we had weekly informal workshops that were PG&E driven, lasting an hour or two apiece, and it was a small number of people on to reduce the load on the utility. And we talked about technical issues. So that's something that we might want to consider going forward as well. Also, posting data requests as they come in would be extraordinarily useful so that we're not wasting our time and your time in duplicative data requests. If Tern asks something or Cal Advocates, we don't want to necessarily repeat that. So that would be very much appreciated too.
Okay, this is Joe, and just for clarity with regards to the data requests, we are posting responses, I think near real time when we are providing them. Posting the responses, posting the questions when we receive them, we have not been doing. We will certainly pursue that approach.
This is Chris Parks with Cal Advocates, and yeah, we appreciate being able to get those data responses off the website in real time as well. Thank you. And in terms of if there were a series of TWG, technical working group meetings, as was done in the ramp, I think those were very, very helpful for the PG&E ramp. And then in terms of topics for the future technical working group meetings or workshops, however it turns out, We did list several in our initial submission to the list a week or two ago that we didn't cover some of those topics. And I think Fred had also suggested from the last workshop that we had a couple days ago that we're all planning, I believe, to send topics or follow-up items on Tuesday. If that's still the case, we'll submit that. Just to highlight a couple of the things from our previous submission, which I don't think we got into details on, which I mentioned earlier, was to discuss the cost risk reduction in RSEs for the mitigations. And I do have that section C1 that Sarah mentioned, and if we had had time, I would have gone over some of those things. I mean, I've highlighted some. If that were, and that was kind of like what we were looking to get out of this workshop, was to talk about some of those RSEs, those mitigations, how they were chosen, why there's certain levels of them, you know, how those decisions were making. So those were kind of like the topics that we had previously said. Another topic that we didn't cover, I think, is the, you know, how the effectiveness and the metrics and the data that is being used to drive the effectiveness of how these mitigations have proven themselves in the past and what's expected in the future, so that we understand the data that will be used to evaluate those. So anyway, those were some things to throw out there for the next topics.
Yeah, I think as we go forward, I think it's becoming clear we have to anticipate that a lot more time will be needed to do this level of discussion that's requested. So it's going to be more than just one more session. I personally like the idea of having a regularly scheduled time of a technical working group meeting, but that the utility needs to have sufficient advance notice of the particular topic that's going to be discussed that day to be ready to provide meaningful answers and have their experts available for that. So I think probably a lot of segmentation of the request is going to be needed to break it down into manageable chunks. Yeah, I think the format of asking you all to send in to the service list your specific requested topics that still need to be reviewed is a good first step. So we have a good sense of the scope of what additional material needs to be covered. So I'd ask that we do that. I think probably close of business next Tuesday is a realistic request for those submittals to the service list.
Fred, thanks for that. We are definitely agreeable to having additional workshops, whether they be formal or informal. And sorry for coming across as short in my discussions. It's just, we do need sufficient time to prepare. We do need sufficient time to make sure the right people are available. So I was reacting to the comment of saying, well, let's just continue it next week. Caught me off guard. I cannot commit our people to next week just because, to be fair to them, we need to make sure they have sufficient time to prepare and they are available. So, but certainly on a going forward basis, if we develop a schedule, be it informal, where I would post them, maybe not post them, just work directly with individual stakeholders, or it's formal, you post it, certainly agreeable to all those options.
Yeah, I think, my team, we're going to consider if we can schedule a formal workshop, but again, that would have a long lead time, and we may be more successful at addressing people's questions if we can begin a series of informal sessions led by Sempra directly.
Fred, this is Wendy. In the PG&E ramp, we did a lot around a lot of meetings around sensitivity analysis. And, so I don't think they were formal workshops. So we did a lot of pre-meetings in order for people to understand enough to be able to ask, different sensitivity analysis to be done. And then we had meetings once that sensitivity analysis was done by the utility. So just the thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the tradition that was established in PG&E ramp, was to have those. I mean, it might not be sensitivity analysis in this case, but those were informally scheduled meetings that got a lot done for the parties, I think.
Yeah, and Fred, we were not, my understanding those meetings took place, yes.
Okay, well, I think the steps would be for Joe, for your team to see what additional topics are formally, are written down by the parties requested, and then to huddle your team and figure out a reasonable series of dates soon that you could host those kinds of meetings and let people know.
And so again, just for clarity of next steps, I tried to capture comments that were written to the extent people are submitting their thoughts next Tuesday, as was mentioned during Wednesday's workshop. I would appreciate you, the parties, writing their thoughts down. It may help me clarify what I was writing down real time.
And if I could just add one more thought, it's helpful. It would be helpful going forward if we were maybe a little less focused on a tightly controlled set of presentations by the utility, and more a more open opportunity to ask questions about a topic. Have the right people there to speak to the wildfire work papers. Who knows those wildfire work papers, and let us ask questions about this line, that line, that line. It doesn't need to be a presentation. We have the work papers. Let's work from the work papers and let us ask our questions. That would be really helpful.
That sounds fine as a way to organize these sessions. To me, I think, having the presentations, it was an attempt to try to schedule a lot of information into this time slot. But I think we didn't anticipate how long just asking questions would add to the total workshop time. But if a particular session topic could be narrowly focused enough, then that seems like a good way to go. You just say, today we're going to explore the RSE calculations on wildfire risk. Boom. Period. End of topic for the day. It's things like that is what I hear you suggesting. It seems fine to me.
Thank you.
So this is Eric Wojcik of UCAN. I'm sorry, I have to be candid here. It seems like there's a lot of presentation of material that's not really very relevant to a lot of the issues that we're concerned about. And then that takes up a lot of time from the discussion. We need to be able to ask questions. And as Tom explains, it's about the interaction. Thank you.
Eric, to be fair, today's presentation was put together specifically to address questions that were asked for today's workshop. To the extent questions go in different directions, we cannot control that, but the topics were specific to questions that were asked. Maybe not by your team, but certainly by other stakeholders.
This is Chris. I would just put in a request that we be able to consider, like we submitted, I guess it was a total of 3 pages, but it wasn't like it was detailed writing. It was pretty explicit about what we were hoping to discuss at this meeting. And so if we can address prior to this one, specifically to this workshop, about addressing those kind of things, you know, if they point to a certain work paper that would be useful, that then could be presented, or we could just display on the during the meeting and then discuss those things. I think that would be useful, but I think that, you know, what we were looking at was kind of very explicit about what we were requesting or voting to be requested. So if those could be included in the discussion, then I think that would be very helpful for us.
It may be necessary to have a separate session for each different party's set of questions, because, you know, in this workshop, we tried to blend as many of the topics that seem to have the greatest interest to the most people into one thing, and we fell way short of covering everybody's, you know, requests. So probably narrowing down each session to focus on just, you know, one party's set of questions might be more productive.
That actually sounds like a really good idea, actually. Anyway.
It could be like the public advocates, you know, day, and then it could be the turn day, and then it could be the messy grade day, perhaps. So I think we have a clear plan for moving ahead. And I apologize that today's session wasn't as productive for everyone as we had all hoped. And that, you know, we're learning as we go. I'm learning as we go. I apologize that I was trying to keep things to a very tight schedule when we needed more time for all these things. So I appreciate everyone's willingness to extend the time. I think we're at a point where we can wrap up for today. How's that sound?
Appreciate the additional discussions, Fred and others.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, thank you, Fred.
We'll
Okay.
see you. It's on.
All right, guys. Have a great weekend.
Okay. Take care, everybody.